You would never make real money, Piper." The insult sliced through the low, elegant hum of the grand ballroom at a luxury Christmas dinner in New York. My father gripped the edges of a mahogany podium and deliberately mocked my empty wallet in front of 400 elite guests. He is the chief executive officer of Caldwell Brokerage, a man who worshipped the illusion of status and profoundly despised my quiet, unassuming life. He smirked, swirling a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch, preparing to finalize a massive institutional bailout with his top banking partner. Suddenly, that partner, Mr. Alistair Thorne, pushed his chair back. The thick wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. He stood up to his full height, signaled the string quartet to stop playing, and commanded the entire room. "Actually, Vincent," Thorne announced, his deep voice vibrating off the vaulted ceilings. "Miss Piper is now a billionaire. She owns the exact liquidity underwriting this entire bank." I offered a slow, deliberate smile as my father's face morphed into a sickening, translucent pale. The crystal flute slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering against the stone floor. He had absolutely no idea I was the one holding the digital guillotine poised directly over his neck. Have you ever sat silently while a narcissistic family member insulted your worth, knowing you possess the exact power to destroy them? Let me know your city in the comments below, and hit subscribe if you love watching toxic arrogance meet absolute financial justice. To fully comprehend the spectacular collapse of Vincent Caldwell, we must rewind the clock to early December of the year 2010. I am 34 years old, and I live a life entirely by my own rigorous design. The first week of December brought a bitter, biting wind to Manhattan, rattling the heavy glass panes of the skyscrapers. Inside my apartment, the climate remained perfectly controlled. I sat before a rig of 6 high-definition monitors, my fingers striking the mechanical keyboard in a relentless, rhythmic cadence. Lines of proprietary code cascaded down the dark screens. I was running stress tests on a new high-frequency trading protocol, manipulating global market data faster than a human eye could track. The servers housed in the adjacent, climate-controlled room hummed with a low, steady frequency. They processed millions of microtransactions, sifting through market inefficiencies and generating legitimate, unencumbered capital. Unlike my father, I did not trade on borrowed time or hollow promises. I traded on pure, infallible logic. This was my sanctuary. I did not wear designer labels. I did not drive a roaring sports car. I spent my days building quantitative algorithmic architecture, creating the financial engines that silently moved billions of dollars across international borders in fractions of a second. My phone vibrated against the thick glass surface of my desk. The caller identification flashed a name I rarely welcomed: Vincent Caldwell. I let the device vibrate 3 times before lifting the receiver. I did not speak first. "Piper," his voice barked through the speaker, carrying the chaotic background noise of blaring taxi horns and frantic street traffic. "I am hosting a preliminary Christmas gala this Friday. Alistair Thorne from the institutional bank will be there. I need you to attend and actually look presentable for once." He did not ask. He issued a rigid command. Vincent viewed every single person in his orbit as a disposable prop designed solely to elevate his own reflection. "I have a system deployment scheduled for Friday," I replied, my tone entirely flat, refusing to offer a single syllable of an apology. He scoffed, a harsh, abrasive sound that crackled over the cellular connection. "Push it back. You write code for some mid-level tech firm. It is not exactly Wall Street. I am trying to secure a $50 million capital injection to expand Caldwell Brokerage. Thorne values family optics. Put on a decent dress, comb your hair, and pretend you understand how the real world works." He severed the connection before I could offer a rebuttal, leaving me listening to the hollow static of dead air. I placed the phone face down on the glass desk. My pulse did not elevate. I did not clench my jaw, nor did I slam my fists in frustration. I simply turned my attention back to the cascading lines of illuminated code. Vincent genuinely believed I was a middle-class failure. He looked at my simple wardrobe and my quiet demeanor and saw a woman who wasted her potential typing meaningless scripts. He believed his brokerage was the absolute pinnacle of financial supremacy. He constantly compared my subdued lifestyle to the loud, chaotic existence of my half-sister, Serena. Serena spent her days swiping heavy metal credit cards at luxury boutiques, draped in designer fabrics she did not earn. She was the perfect daughter for a man who valued the wrapping paper more than the empty box inside. He did not realize that the mid-level tech firm he mocked was a shadow entity. I owned it entirely. I engineered the precise algorithms that provided the underlying liquidity for the very institutional bank he was currently begging for a bailout. I was the silent, invisible architect holding the structural pillars of his entire industry. Vincent operated on noise, aggressive leverage, and desperate posturing. He leveraged toxic assets, packaging them into complex derivatives to create a blinding mirage of immense wealth. He let tailors measure his shoulders for bespoke suits crafted from imported wool, charging the staggering invoices to corporate cards that teetered dangerously close to their absolute limits. He dined at exclusive steakhouses, projecting dominance while secretly dodging frantic margin calls from his creditors. His entire existence, his legacy, and his towering ego relied on securing that $50 million lifeline before the end of the fiscal year. Without that massive capital injection, Caldwell Brokerage would inevitably breach its loan covenants. The firm would shatter into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. I pressed a specific key combination, executing the final trading simulation. The progress bar illuminated the darkroom, turning from a cautionary red to a solid, undeniable green. My architecture was flawless. My capital was absolute. I stood up from my ergonomic chair and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of my penthouse, a property purchased entirely through an anonymous corporate trust. I looked down at the snow-dusted streets of the financial district. The yellow cabs crawled like tiny insects through the deep concrete canyons. Somewhere down there, my father was screaming at an underpaid assistant, desperately trying to maintain an illusion of control. He demanded I play the role of the quiet, unimpressive daughter. He needed me to stand in the shadows, serving as a dull contrast to his fabricated success, and acting as a foil to Serena, who played the part of his golden heir with reckless, entitled perfection. I decided right then to accept his invitation. I would attend his gala. I would wear a simple, unbranded dress. I would stand quietly in his shadow. A true apex predator never announces its presence until the trap is fully sealed. I would let him build his fragile house of cards as high as possible, allowing his sheer arrogance to blind him to the structural rot crumbling beneath his own feet. The countdown to Christmas had officially begun, and the gifts I planned to deliver would leave his empire in absolute ashes. I opened the heavy oak doors of my walk-in closet and bypassed the row of bespoke, tailored suits. My fingers brushed past imported Italian wool and fine cashmere, seeking the darkest, most unremarkable corner of the wardrobe. I withdrew a plain, charcoal gray shift dress. The fabric lacked any designer emblem. It possessed no structural embellishment. It was a garment entirely devoid of ambition. I pulled the dress off the hanger. This uniform perfectly matched the camouflage my father demanded. Vincent Caldwell required an audience for his manufactured grandeur. He did not desire a daughter. He desired a prop, for as long as I could remember. He viewed my existence as a disappointing administrative error. He reserved his paternal affection, his financial resources, and his public adoration exclusively for his golden child, my half-sister, Serena. The contrast between us dictated the entire family dynamic. Just 2 months prior, in October of 2010, Vincent hosted a lavish celebration for Serena's 24th birthday. He rented the glass-enclosed rooftop of a premier Manhattan hotel, filling the space with towering floral arrangements and a string quartet. He stood before the crowd of business associates and socialites, pulling a velvet box from his tuxedo jacket. He handed it to Serena. She snapped the hinge open, retrieved the silver keys to a brand-new German sports car, and shrieked, throwing her arms around his neck. Vincent beamed, soaking in the applause, the absolute picture of a benevolent patriarch. I stood near a melting ice sculpture in the corner of the room, Holding a glass of club soda, I wore sensible black loafers and a modest blazer. Vincent broke away from the photographers, strode across the polished floor, and stopped directly in front of me. He did not offer a greeting. He looked down at my scuffed shoes, curling his lip in undisguised revulsion. He reached into his pocket, extracted a crisp $100 bill, and shoved it against my chest. "Buy some decent footwear, Piper," he sneered, his voice laced with heavy condescension. "You look like a substitute teacher. Try not to embarrass the Caldwell name while you linger near the catering table." A lesser woman might have slapped his hand away. A fragile daughter might have fled the rooftop. Weeping in the elevator, I executed neither action. I took the paper currency. I folded it perfectly in half, sliding it into the pocket of my blazer. I offered him a blank, unblinking stare, turned on my heel, and exited the venue. I returned to my apartment, sat at my workstation, and finalized a high-frequency trading algorithm. When the markets opened the following Monday morning, that specific script generated $2 million in unencumbered profit in exactly 14 seconds. Vincent constantly ridiculed my frugality. He mocked my dedication to a boring tech job, frequently telling his associates that I sat in a cubicle fixing broken keyboards for a mediocre salary. He remained utterly oblivious to the reality of my existence. I did not fix keyboards. I built the architecture that controlled the flow of global capital. I routinely logged 80-hour work weeks, sacrificing sleep, social engagements, and basic comfort to construct proprietary trading algorithms. The market of 2010 remained volatile, still shivering from the massive financial collapse of 2008. While traditional brokers panicked, I engineered mathematical models that exploited the microscopic latency between market makers. I compartmentalized his psychological abuse with the exact same ruthless efficiency I applied to my code. Whenever Vincent issued a biting insult, whenever he prioritized Serena's vapid demands over my basic presence, I did not internalize the rejection. I visualized the emotional trauma as a faulty line of syntax. I isolated it. I deleted it. I built an impenetrable armor forged from absolute financial independence. I refused to beg for his approval. I refused to seek his love. I channeled every ounce of familial betrayal into fuel, burning it to power an apex intellect that operated far beyond his comprehension. My physical routine mirrored my mental discipline. My alarm sounded at 4 a.m. every single day. I stepped into a freezing shower, letting the icy water shock my nervous system into hyper-awareness. I struck a heavy leather punching bag in my private gym until my knuckles ached, driving the weakness out of my muscles. I hardened my body to ensure my mind remained a fortress. After finalizing my decision to attend his upcoming gala, I returned to my desk and pulled up the public financial disclosures for Caldwell Brokerage. If I intended to stand in his shadow and watch his empire crumble, I needed to inspect the structural rot weakening his foundation. I typed a rapid sequence of commands, bypassing the superficial marketing brochures on his corporate website, and dug directly into the filings submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The monitor cast a harsh, pale blue glare across my face as the data populated the screen. Caldwell Brokerage was bleeding out. Vincent projected the image of a titan, but his balance sheets exposed a desperately frightened man. He and his chief financial officer, Trent Wallace, operated an institution built on staggering deception. I highlighted a sequence of cells tracking their current liabilities. Trent Wallace had signed off on accounting maneuvers that bordered on active criminality. They hoarded subprime remnants and toxic commercial real estate loans, burying the dead weight under layers of aggressive leverage. They bundled the failing assets, slapped fabricated valuations on the portfolios, and leveraged them to borrow operational cash. I ran a diagnostic script to calculate their current debt-to-equity ratio. The result flashed on the screen in stark, unforgiving red digits, 40-1. Caldwell Brokerage teetered on the absolute edge of a catastrophic margin call. I scrolled down to the debt maturity schedules. The numbers painted a desperate, ticking timeline. A massive balloon payment of $75 million was due on the 31st of December, 2010. Vincent lacked the liquidity to cover even a fraction of that obligation. The firm possessed no life raft. The accounts ran dry. The creditors circled. This mathematical reality explained his frantic behavior. This explained the mandated Christmas gala. Vincent desperately needed an institutional partner to inject fresh capital into his failing veins before the fiscal year ended. He targeted Alistair Thorne. Thorne commanded a top-tier institutional bank, possessing the exact liquidity Vincent required to survive the impending deadline. Vincent planned to use the gala to project stability, wealth, and generational legacy. He invited Serena to play the role of the glamorous heir, wearing stolen diamonds and flashing bright, empty smiles. He ordered me to attend to complete the family portrait, a quiet, drab background character designed to make his fabricated success shine brighter by contrast. He needed Thorne to look at the Caldwell family and see a dynasty worthy of a massive financial lifeline. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, interlacing my fingers behind my head. The sheer audacity of his delusion fascinated me. Vincent and Trent Wallace actively managed a sinking ship, yet they continued to purchase premium paint to coat the rotting hull. I closed the financial disclosures and locked my workstation. I walked back toward the closet, my eyes resting on the charcoal gray shift dress hanging against the dark wood. Vincent wanted a disposable asset. He wanted a silent sheep to stand at the edge of his grand stage. I reached out and smoothed the coarse fabric of the dress. I would grant him exactly what he requested. I would play the part flawlessly. I would step into his arena, lower my eyes, and blend into the background. I would let him execute his desperate performance for Alistair Thorne, watching silently as he danced on the edge of a $75 million cliff. He thought he commanded the board. He failed to realize I owned the ground beneath his feet. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, blurring the glittering lights of the Manhattan skyline. The temperature inside remained a constant 68 degrees. It was a Monday evening, mid-December 2010. I sat before my 6-monitor array, cycling through routine maintenance on my secondary algorithms. My primary attention focused on a seemingly mundane task, rotating the digital security keys on my personal, compartmentalized financial accounts. A minor notification pinged on the bottom left screen, a single, solitary line of amber text interrupted the scrolling green code. A hard inquiry had just registered on my secondary credit profile. I stopped typing. The silence in the room amplified the low drone of the cooling fans. I hold no personal debt. I purchase assets entirely in cash through blind corporate trusts. A hard credit inquiry required my explicit, verified authorization, usually accompanied by a physical signature or a multi-factor cryptographic bypass. I had authorized neither. I did not dismiss the alert. I dragged the notification window to my center monitor and expanded the raw data feed. The inquiry originated from a mid-tier commercial underwriting firm, a subsidiary known for processing high-yield, high-risk corporate debt. I launched a proprietary packet-sniffing diagnostic, a tool I originally engineered to track hostile incursions into my trading liquidity pools. I redirected the algorithm, instructing it to tunnel into the underwriter's public-facing servers. I stripped away the superficial encryption layers, bypassing their rudimentary firewalls in exactly 4 minutes. The application file materialized on my screen. I opened the digital dossier. My social security number stared back at me, resting neatly at the top of a commercial loan application. The requested principal amount rested in the adjacent column, $50 million. I leaned forward, my spine straightened, pressing firmly against the mesh back of my ergonomic chair. I did not gasp. I did not slam my palms against the glass desk. The sudden, freezing realization of familial betrayal washed over me. But I immediately compartmentalized the shock, shoving the emotion into a sterile mental vault. My vision tunneled, focusing entirely on the black text illuminating the monitor. Vincent Caldwell was not just an arrogant, failing chief executive officer. He was a desperate, reckless criminal. I dissected the forged application with clinical, surgical precision. The document required extensive proof of collateral and pristine financial standing to even clear the preliminary automated underwriting software. Vincent's brokerage possessed a toxic 40-to-1 debt ratio. No legitimate bank would lend him a single dime. He needed a guarantor. a phantom entity boasting flawless credit, zero liabilities, and verified liquid assets. He hijacked my identity to build his life raft. I scrolled through the attached exhibits. My eyes tracked over falsified collateral documents. The paperwork pledged luxury commercial real estate properties I supposedly owned in Delaware and New Jersey, assets fabricated entirely out of thin air, authenticated by fraudulent notary stamps. Next, I opened the income verification letters. They bore the official letterhead of Caldwell Brokerage. The text declared me a senior executive consultant for the firm, claiming I earned a staggering 7-figure annual salary, a forged digital signature, mimicking the precise slant and loop of my handwriting, anchored the bottom of the page. The sheer audacity of the forgery demanded a cold, mathematical respect. Vincent and his chief financial officer, Trent Wallace, had weaponized the exact same pristine financial discipline I spent my entire adult life cultivating. They stole the armor I built to protect myself and used it to shield their sinking empire. To secure a $50 million loan, the underwriters demanded more than just a signature. They required a verified digital submission trail. I needed to isolate the exact origin of this application. I opened a command terminal and initiated a deep trace routing protocol. I extracted the metadata embedded within the forged portable document format files. Every digital action leaves a footprint, a microscopic breadcrumb trail leading back to the source. The metadata contained the author identification, the creation timestamp, and the original Internet Protocol address of the uploading machine. I watched the routing map populate across my right-side monitor. The signal bounced from a proxy server in the Cayman Islands, hopped to a relay node in Chicago, and funneled through a virtual private network terminating in Manhattan. Trent Wallace believed a standard commercial proxy service would mask his location. He suffered from the catastrophic delusion that he understood digital obfuscation better than an algorithmic architect. I wrote a decryption script, unleashing it against the virtual private network's vulnerable handshake protocol. The proxy shield shattered in 32 seconds. The true, unmasked Internet Protocol address flashed onto my screen in bright, undeniable white digits. I cross-referenced the digits with the North American Regional Internet Registry. The address belonged to a static block assigned exclusively to the Caldwell Brokerage corporate headquarters. I ran a subnet mask diagnostic, narrowing the physical location down to a specific local area network on the 42nd floor of their Manhattan high-rise, the executive suite, Trent Wallace's office. My hands hovered over the mechanical keyboard, the physical reality of the situation locked into place. My father and his right-hand man executed a coordinated, premeditated federal crime. They committed aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and severe bank fraud. I lifted my hands from the keyboard, stood up from the desk, and walked toward the kitchen. I retrieved a heavy crystal tumbler from the cabinet, filled it with crushed ice, and poured a measure of cold, sparkling water. The ice cracked sharply, the sound echoing in the silent penthouse. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The freezing liquid chilled my throat, mirroring the absolute glacial calm settling over my mind. Vincent intended to use this $50 million fraudulent loan as leverage. He needed this capital to artificially inflate his balance sheet before his Friday gala with Alistair Thorne. If Thorne saw $50 million in fresh, unencumbered liquidity sitting in the Caldwell accounts, he would authorize the massive institutional bailout Vincent desperately needed to survive the end of the year. Vincent planned to sacrifice my future to purchase his salvation. The moment the loan defaulted, an inevitable outcome given the brokerage's massive liabilities, the commercial underwriters would come for the guarantor. They would seize my assets. They would obliterate my credit. They would drag my name into federal bankruptcy court, subjecting my shadow tech firm to catastrophic public scrutiny. He threw me onto the tracks to stop his own runaway train. I walked back to my workstation and set the crystal tumbler on a slate coaster. I stared at the forged signatures illuminating the center monitor. A weaker individual would immediately dial emergency services, screaming into the receiver, begging law enforcement to intervene. A frightened daughter would march into the Caldwell Brokerage lobby, confront her father, and demand he cancel the application. I executed neither action. Confrontation provides the enemy with time to destroy evidence. Panic offers the adversary a window to construct an alternate narrative. I operated in the shadows, dwelling in the microscopic spaces where arrogant men leave themselves entirely exposed. I sat down in the ergonomic chair. I did not block the loan application. I did not freeze my credit profile. I reached into the underwriting server and manipulated the security flags, ensuring the forged documents bypassed the final manual review process. I smoothed the digital path, actively facilitating my father's federal crime. I wanted the $50 million to clear. I wanted the stolen capital to land squarely in the Caldwell Brokerage accounts. I wanted Vincent to feel the intoxicating, euphoric rush of absolute victory. He needed to believe his fraudulent scheme succeeded flawlessly. I initiated a ghost node monitoring sequence, tethering a silent tracking algorithm directly to the loan's routing numbers. The moment Trent Wallace attempted to move that capital, my servers would record the transaction hash, logging the exact destination, timestamp, and authorization credential. Vincent assumed he hunted a helpless, technologically illiterate sheep. He possessed no idea he had just handed a loaded weapon to the apex predator guarding the gates of his own industry. The digital snare was perfectly set. I cracked my knuckles, the sharp pops echoing against the glass desk, and prepared for the physical escalation I knew must inevitably follow. The digital manipulation of a commercial loan application represented only the preliminary phase of my father's fraudulent strategy. He possessed my forged signatures. He controlled the falsified income verification documents. He routed the application through a manipulated virtual private network to mask the origin. However, the underwriters of 2010 required one final, non-repudiable layer of authorization to release $50 million in corporate liquidity. They required a physical cryptographic handshake. I utilized a biometric hardware token for all high-level identity verification, a matte black, titanium-cased drive that generated a rolling, air-gapped encryption key without inserting that specific physical device into a terminal and authenticating the transmission. The $50 million would remain locked in the underwriter's escrow account indefinitely. Vincent knew this hardware key existed. Years prior, he observed me using a similar device to authorize a routine tax document for a defunct family trust. He lacked the technical vocabulary to understand the cryptographic hash functions, but he understood the basic, immutable function of the device. It functioned as the ultimate digital padlock. To finalize his massive federal crime, he needed to steal that key. He would not execute the physical intrusion himself. Vincent avoided manual labor, viewing physical risk as an endeavor reserved for subordinates. He delegated the task to his chief financial officer, Trent Wallace. Trent wore bespoke Italian suits and projected a veneer of sophisticated corporate dominance. But beneath the expensive wool, he operated as Vincent's desperate attack dog. Trent needed this institutional bailout just as badly as my father did to preserve his own inflated salary and cover his massive personal debts. I anticipated the physical escalation. I mapped out the exact parameters of their impending crime and engineered my environment to invite the intrusion. The primary entrance to my penthouse featured a military-grade electronic deadbolt, a locking mechanism entirely impervious to standard picking tools. To ensure Trent could bypass the door without triggering a building-wide lockdown, I deliberately degraded the firmware. I rolled back the encryption protocol, lowering the security threshold to mimic a generic, easily manipulated commercial lock. I positioned the titanium hardware token inside the bottom mahogany drawer of my home office desk. I did not leave it sitting in plain sight. That would arouse suspicion. I buried it beneath a stack of obsolete, printed code and a heavy leather-bound ledger, forcing the intruder to search for his prize. The following morning, Tuesday, arrived, bringing a sharp, freezing wind that rattled the thick glass windows of my apartment. I prepared to vacate the premises, setting the stage for Trent's clandestine operation. I dressed in a structured, navy blue blazer and dark trousers. At exactly 8 in the morning, I exited the penthouse, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. I stepped into the hallway, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me, ensuring the degraded deadbolt engaged with a solid, metallic click. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, Holding my cellular device to my ear, I spoke loudly, confirming the details of a fabricated, day-long corporate strategy meeting, projecting the distinct posture of a busy, overwhelmed employee destined to remain off-site for the next 10 hours. I walked out into the freezing Manhattan morning, hailed a yellow taxi, and rode 30 blocks south. I did not attend a business meeting. I walked into a windowless, climate-controlled server room I maintained under a blind shell corporation. I sat before a solitary high-resolution monitor and placed my encrypted cellular device on the steel desk. I waited. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, my phone vibrated. A silent, flashing red notification illuminated the screen. The perimeter defense grid registered a mechanical bypass. Trent Wallace had breached the front door. I did not activate the video surveillance feed. I required pure, unadulterated telemetry data to map the physical escalation of his crime. I opened a command terminal and watched the raw data stream from the motion detectors embedded seamlessly within the drywall of my penthouse. The foyer sensor tripped. 2 seconds later, the hallway sensor registered movement. I tracked his progression block by block. Trent bypassed the kitchen and the living room entirely, moving with the frantic, targeted velocity of a man operating on borrowed time. He headed straight down the corridor, aiming directly for the home office. The office motion sensor illuminated my screen. The telemetry data painted a vivid picture of severe, undisciplined panic. The infrared beams broke in rapid, erratic succession. I visualized him tearing through the room. The sensors near the tall bookshelves triggered repeatedly as he pulled volumes from the shelves, searching for a hidden safe. The perimeter alarms near the filing cabinets flared as he yanked the heavy metal drawers open, shuffling violently through reams of paper. He operated under immense psychological pressure. Every passing second increased his exposure. He was a corporate executive committing aggravated burglary, sweating through his expensive tailored suit, desperate to find the small titanium drive that held the key to his salvation. Finally, the localized sensor beneath the mahogany desk tripped. I watched the data stream register a shift in weight distribution. He pulled the bottom drawer open. The motion detectors logged his hands rummaging through the decoy stack of printed code. Pushing the heavy leather ledger aside, the piezoelectric weight sensor installed beneath the false bottom of the drawer registered a sudden loss of exactly 42 grams. The titanium hardware key was gone. Trent possessed the final, critical piece of the puzzle. He secured the physical authorization required to sign the forged collateral documents and release the $50 million. The motion sensors tracked his immediate retreat. However, his velocity changed. He stopped rushing. The data logged him standing stationary near the desk for 40 seconds. He was executing the cover-up. He pushed the mahogany drawer shut. He realigned the leather desk chair, ensuring the wheels rested precisely on the carpet indentations he found them in. He retraced his steps through the home office, pausing at the filing cabinets to push the metal drawers flush against their tracks. He moved back out into the hallway, closing the office door behind him. The foyer sensor tripped one final time. The primary door contact sensor registered the heavy oak door opening and closing. The electronic deadbolt engaged. The penthouse fell entirely silent. The telemetry data ceased, returning the command terminal to a resting state of solid green lines. Trent Wallace exited the building clutching the stolen token, operating under a catastrophic terminal delusion. He assumed he executed a flawless covert operation. He meticulously reconstructed the physical environment, placing every book and paper back into its approximate original position. Believing he erased his physical footprint entirely, he left the apartment exactly as he found it. He returned to the Caldwell Brokerage executive suite, convinced he held the ultimate advantage over a technologically illiterate target. He assumed I functioned as a naive, oblivious woman who would return home, toss her keys on the kitchen counter, and never notice the brief, surgical intrusion into her sanctuary. He believed his meticulous realignment of a desk chair protected him from discovery. He failed to comprehend that I did not navigate my environment through superficial observation. I navigated my world through absolute, uncompromising data. I tracked his exact body weight, the precise duration of his search, and the specific 42 grams of missing titanium. The physical escalation was complete. Vincent and Trent held the digital application, the forged signatures, and the biometric key. They possessed everything they needed to steal $50 million and destroy my identity. I closed the command terminal on the steel desk, picked up my leather briefcase, and prepared to return to the scene of the crime. The trap required visual confirmation, and the afternoon promised a flawless, high-definition viewing of their treason. I returned to the penthouse at precisely 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the exact same Tuesday. The freezing wind whipped against the exterior glass, but the interior maintained its sterile, 68-degree equilibrium. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl near the entrance. The metallic clatter pierced the heavy silence. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps muffled by the thick wool runner. I paused at the threshold of my home office. I scanned the environment. Trent Wallace possessed a criminal mind, but he lacked forensic discipline. He assumed he restored the room to its pristine condition. He aligned the leather chair. He shut the mahogany drawer. However, he failed to recognize the microscopic deviations. A single sheet of printed code rested a fraction of an inch out of alignment. A dust pattern on the bookshelf broke where his hand brushed against the mahogany spine of a reference volume. To a casual observer, the room appeared untouched. To an algorithmic architect, the disruption screamed across the physical space. I bypassed the desk entirely. I approached a seemingly blank section of drywall near the corner bookcase. I pressed my palm against the smooth surface, aligning my fingerprints with a concealed biometric scanner embedded beneath the paint. A faint mechanical hum vibrated through the wall. A narrow panel slid open, revealing an air-gapped secondary terminal. I sat on a small steel stool and powered up the hidden surveillance array. I bypassed the standard security software, accessing the raw, high-definition video files stored on a localized, encrypted drive. The camera, camouflaged within the smoke detector directly above my desk, possessed a flawless, unobstructed view of the room. I inputted the timestamp corresponding to the perimeter breach from that morning. The video feed populated the screen. I watched the digital ghost of Trent Wallace infiltrate my sanctuary. The lens captured every frantic, undisciplined movement in razor-sharp clarity. Trent shoved the heavy oak door open. He stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his expensive tailored suit wrinkling around his shoulders. I observed the profound desperation etching deep lines into his forehead. A heavy sheen of sweat glistened under the overhead lights. He tore through the bookshelves, yanking volumes from their resting places, his panic escalating with every passing second. He moved to the desk. The camera recorded the exact moment he pulled the bottom mahogany drawer open. I watched his hands rifle through the decoy documents. I saw his fingers close around the matte black titanium hardware key. The relief that washed over his face bordered on grotesque. He pocketed the token, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and painstakingly attempted to erase his physical presence from the room. I terminated the playback. The logical progression crystallized with devastating clarity. Trent Wallace served as the instrument, but Vincent Caldwell orchestrated the strike. My father ordered the physical theft of my biometric token to seal my financial doom. He authorized a felony to finalize the $50 million forgery. I swiveled the stool away from the hidden terminal and stared at the sleek, black telephone resting on my primary desk. A standard victim would lift the receiver. A frightened civilian would dial the authorities, report a burglary, and surrender control of the situation to local law enforcement. I did not touch the phone. I refused to dial emergency services. Engaging the police over a stolen piece of hardware would immediately trigger an active investigation. Tipping my hand, Vincent retained a fleet of aggressive corporate attorneys. If a detective knocked on the doors of Caldwell Brokerage, Vincent would shred the forged documents, wipe his servers, and claim a misunderstanding. He would reduce a massive federal conspiracy to a localized property dispute. I refused to grant him the opportunity to construct a defense. I returned the concealed panel to its locked position and walked over to my primary workstation. I sat in my ergonomic chair and initiated my ghost node monitoring terminal. If Trent stole the key this morning, he intended to use it this afternoon. I stared at the dark monitors, waiting for the cryptographic handshake. At exactly 2:45 in the afternoon, the alert triggered. A bright green notification sliced across the black screen. The stolen titanium token engaged. I routed the telemetry data through my tracing algorithm. The hardware key synchronized with the commercial underwriter's servers. Trent inputted the final digital signature, verifying the forged identity. The system authenticated the transaction. The underwriter released $50 million in commercial liquidity. I tracked the digital flow of the stolen capital. I did not attempt to sever the connection. I allowed the financial pipeline to remain wide open, actively mapping the exact offshore routing numbers they utilized. The money exited the underwriter's escrow account in a massive, singular block. I peeled back the routing layers as the funds bounced across the grid. Trent transferred the capital into a clearinghouse registered in Delaware. He did not let the money rest. 14 seconds later, the funds vaulted across the Atlantic, landing in a corporate registry located in the Cayman Islands. I extracted the shell company's registration data. It existed as a blind entity, a classic obfuscation tactic designed to wash the origin of the capital. The funds sat in the offshore account for exactly 3 minutes before executing the final jump. The $50 million slammed directly into the primary corporate accounts of Caldwell Brokerage. The numbers stabilized on my screen. The grotesque masterpiece of their fraud revealed itself entirely. Vincent possessed absolutely no intention of utilizing the $50 million for operational growth, payroll, or client investments. He parked the stolen liquidity squarely on his master balance sheet. He executed the heist to artificially inflate his total assets. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. The impending Christmas gala served as the catalyst. Alistair Thorne. Thorne's top-tier institutional bank demanded strict proof of immense collateral and unencumbered liquidity before authorizing any massive corporate bailouts. Vincent intended to present my stolen, laundered identity to Thorne as legitimate Caldwell capital. He manufactured a phantom fortress to mask his crumbling ruins. He planned to slide a fabricated balance sheet across a luxury dining table, pointing to the $50 million as undeniable proof of his supremacy. He leveraged my pristine identity to purchase his own salvation. Vincent believed he engineered an impenetrable illusion. He believed he successfully sacrificed his daughter to secure his legacy. He failed to comprehend the fundamental flaw in his architecture. He routed the stolen capital through a monitored pipeline I controlled entirely. He invited Thorne to inspect a vault while I possessed the detonator. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp against the quiet hum of the servers. I compiled the offshore routing hashes, the Delaware clearinghouse records, and the high-definition footage of the morning break-in. I dragged the files into a heavily encrypted folder. The afternoon yielded exactly what I required. Vincent secured his bait. Now, I possessed the leverage to spring the trap. I hovered my index finger over the escape key. A single, decisive keystroke would sever the connection. I possessed the administrative capability to recall the $50 million, forcing the capital back into the commercial underwriter's escrow vault. Blocking the transaction would instantly protect my credit profile. It would neutralize the immediate threat. It would dismantle my father's fraudulent lifeline before the money ever reached his accounts. I pulled my hand away from the mechanical keyboard. Stopping a crime prevents injury, but it allows the criminal to retreat, regroup, and strike again. Deflecting the blow merely prolongs the war. I did not desire a prolonged conflict with Vincent Caldwell. I intended to amputate the arm that swung the weapon. Instead of terminating the transaction, I quietly weaponized it. I engaged my ghost node clearance. This proprietary terminal operated completely outside standard financial grids, a stealth architecture I originally engineered to monitor hostile incursions into my offshore liquidity pools. I opened a new command line and rapidly authored a specialized tracking algorithm. I designed the script to function as a digital parasite. I executed the command. The algorithm injected itself directly into the data packets carrying the $50 million. It bonded to the transaction hash, burying itself deep within the digital signature. I did not block the flow of capital, I illuminated it. I watched the illuminated data stream across my center monitor. The stolen funds departed the Delaware clearinghouse. plunging into the transatlantic fiber optic network. I tracked the capital as it vaulted southward, surfacing in a server farm located in the Caribbean. Vincent and Trent Wallace attempted to wash the money. They utilized the standard, unimaginative playbook of amateur corporate criminals. They routed the liquidity through a foreign jurisdiction, hoping international borders and strict privacy laws would sever the digital paper trail. The $50 million slammed into a corporate registry located in the Caribbean. The receiving entity bore the name Vanguard Horizon. I needed to inspect the vessel holding my stolen identity. I targeted the Caribbean Financial Registry. The local jurisdiction erected heavy cryptographic walls to deter casual audits and shield their offshore clientele. Casual audits do not apply to my skill set. I deployed a packet-sniffing algorithm against their primary firewall, exploiting a vulnerability in their outdated handshake protocol. The encryption shield shattered in exactly 45 seconds. The raw corporate registry data spilled across my right-side monitor. I combed through the filing documents for Vanguard Horizon. Trent Wallace purchased this entity off the shelf exactly 2 weeks prior. He paid a nominal, expedited fee, seeking a fast, anonymous vehicle to launder the $50 million before dragging it back to Manhattan. He secured the shell company quickly, but he failed to perform basic forensic due diligence. I copied Vanguard Horizon's corporate identification number. I opened a secure, encrypted tunnel to a database aggregator that pulled public records from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I pasted the identification number into the search query and initiated a cross-reference diagnostic. My screen flashed a violent, undeniable red. A Level 4 priority alert populated the monitor. Federal watchdogs heavily flagged Vanguard Horizon 18 months prior. The corporate entity did not exist as a clean, anonymous holding company. It previously served as a primary laundering artery for a massive, international securities fraud syndicate. I scrolled through the unclassified federal case files. The authorities never seized the shell company. Instead, they weaponized it. Federal agents actively monitored the routing numbers, utilizing Vanguard Horizon as a digital honeypot. They logged every single transaction, every routing hash, and every internet protocol address that brushed against the tainted ledgers. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet penthouse, the absolute staggering magnitude of their blunder locked into place. Vincent's profound technological ignorance just handed me a weapon of mass destruction. He and Trent believed offshore equated to invisible. They wore expensive suits and commanded corner offices, assuming their corporate titles granted them intellectual supremacy. They lacked the apex intellect required to understand modern digital architecture. They took my pristine financial identity, strapped $50 million to it, and dragged the entire package through radioactive federal waste. They routed the stolen capital through a pipeline actively monitored by federal agents. The radioactivity now clung permanently to their transaction. By allowing the transaction to proceed, I secured their absolute destruction. The snare possessed perfect, inescapable geometry. Vincent required this $50 million to artificially inflate the Caldwell Brokerage balance sheet. He intended to walk into his scheduled Friday Christmas gala and present those specific funds to Alistair Thorne. He planned to slide the fabricated financial statements across a luxury dining table, using the stolen liquidity as leverage to secure a massive institutional bailout from Thorne's bank. The moment Vincent claims that $50 million as legitimate Caldwell capital, the trap snaps shut. The moment he utilizes those specific, tainted funds to solicit institutional backing, he elevates a localized case of identity theft to a catastrophic federal offense. He commits severe, premeditated wire fraud involving an internationally flagged money laundering syndicate. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would not merely audit his brokerage. They would dismantle it with battering rams. They would seize his servers, freeze his remaining assets, and march him out of his executive suite in handcuffs. I shifted my focus back to the center monitor. The tracking parasite confirmed the final jump. The $50 million exited Vanguard Horizon, crossing back into the United States and settled permanently into the primary corporate accounts of Caldwell Brokerage. The transaction completed. The bait sat squarely in his vault. I extracted the federal watch lists, saving the red notices and the active monitoring logs. I exported the complete offshore routing history, verifying the connection between Trent's original Internet Protocol address, the Caribbean honeypot, and the Caldwell corporate accounts. I dragged every piece of digital evidence into my heavily encrypted master dossier. I locked the file. Vincent possessed the money. He believed he outsmarted a naive daughter. He believed his crumbling legacy would survive the winter. He felt the intoxicating rush of unearned victory, utterly blind to the federal crosshairs painting his chest. I turned off the monitors, plunging the home office into darkness. The glow of the server rack cast long, faint shadows across the hardwood floor. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the freezing Manhattan night. Vincent manufactured his own guillotine. He sharpened the blade himself. I merely possessed the discipline to step back and let gravity execute the sentence. The sun rose over the East River on Wednesday morning, casting a sharp, freezing light across the Manhattan skyline. Inside my penthouse, the ambient temperature held steady. I sat before my workstation, a fresh cup of black coffee resting on the glass desk. The steam curled upward, dissipating into the cool air. The digital trap I armed Tuesday night hummed silently across my 6-monitor array. The $50 million sat inside the Caldwell Brokerage primary corporate account. I expected Vincent to hold the stolen liquidity in strict reserve, preserving the capital to guarantee Alistair Thorne's institutional bailout at the Friday gala. I underestimated the sheer, undisciplined hubris of my family at exactly 10:15 in the morning. A localized alert flashed across my tracking terminal. The Caldwell corporate account registered a disbursement. The ledger hemorrhaged capital. I expanded the transaction block. The outflow did not route to a creditor. It did not settle an outstanding corporate debt. The capital funneled directly into a limitless, heavy metal corporate credit card. The cardholder name populated the screen, Serena Caldwell. My half-sister possessed a 24-year-old palate for unearned luxury. Vincent permitted the expenditures. He required Serena to project an aura of immaculate, aristocratic wealth, utilizing her as a walking billboard to signal extreme prosperity to the Wall Street elite. He funded her vanity to construct his illusion, actively encouraging her to drain the newly inflated liquidity pool. Serena operated with total complicity. She understood the brokerage faced severe financial starvation, yet the moment she sensed fresh capital in the accounts, she struck with the predatory instinct of a parasite. I initiated a dual-screen forensic split. On the left monitor, I tracked the live application programming interface of the Caldwell banking ledger. On the right monitor, I pulled up her public social media feeds. The digital paper trail generated itself in real time. At 10:42, the corporate card swiped at a premier vintage jeweler on Fifth Avenue. The ledger registered a charge of $65,000. 4 minutes later, Serena's social media feed updated. A high-resolution photograph materialized on my right monitor. Serena sat in a plush, velvet chair inside the boutique, holding a glass of champagne. A heavy, diamond-encrusted tennis necklace rested against her collarbone. The caption read, "Daddy's holiday capital expansion looks brilliant on me. Early Christmas gifts." She broadcasted her theft to the entire world. I did not shake my head. I did not sigh. I simply typed a command string, deploying an extraction script against her post. The algorithm stripped the photograph of its metadata. I isolated the exchangeable image file format data, pulling the exact global positioning system coordinates and the digital timestamp. I matched the geolocation and the time precisely to the $65,000 charge on the banking ledger. I downloaded the receipt, the transaction hash, and the photograph, binding them together with an immutable cryptographic seal. The spending spree accelerated throughout Wednesday afternoon and bled heavily into Thursday. Serena marched across Manhattan, leaving a staggering, undeniable wake of financial negligence. She treated the stolen $50 million as her personal inheritance. She swiped the heavy metal card at a luxury European fashion house, liquidating $32,000 on imported leather handbags and cashmere trench coats. My left monitor registered the debit. My right monitor captured her strutting down the sidewalk, weighed down by branded shopping bags. She reserved a private table at an exclusive Meatpacking District nightclub on Wednesday night, authorizing a $12,000 charge for vintage champagne. The social media upload surfaced at 2 in the morning. She danced on a leather banquette, waving sparklers, surrounded by sycophants. Every swipe drained the stolen liquidity. Every photograph cemented her active, malicious complicity. She squandered capital forged from my stolen identity, wrapping herself in stolen silk to mock the very sister she robbed. Her sheer, unapologetic greed built a pristine, impenetrable cage. She geotagged her locations. She flaunted the specific items. She constructed an evidentiary timeline so precise, so incredibly transparent, that a federal prosecutor would not need to argue the facts. They would merely need to press play. I compiled the harvest. I closed the live tracking feeds on Thursday afternoon. The raw data volume demanded meticulous organization. A massive dump of files often confuses law enforcement, allowing expensive defense attorneys to muddy the narrative. I refused to leave any margin for legal maneuvering. I intended to deliver a weapon fully loaded and aimed directly at the heart of Caldwell Brokerage. I created a master directory on my heavily encrypted, air-gapped server. I named the root file Caldwell Execution. I structured the evidence with the cold, objective precision of a federal indictment, utilizing a color-coded index to separate the escalating tiers of their felonies. I generated the first folder, assigning it a stark, blood-red tab. This section housed the physical perimeter breach. I imported the high-definition surveillance video of Trent Wallace tearing through my home office on Tuesday morning. I attached the raw motion sensor telemetry data, proving his exact path and the duration of his search. I included the serial number of the stolen biometric titanium key, linking the physical theft directly to the digital authorization. I created the second folder, applying a deep blue tab. This contained the digital forgery. I embedded the falsified commercial loan applications and the forged income verification letters. I mapped the Internet Protocol addresses, drawing a thick, undeniable digital line from the commercial underwriter's servers straight back to Trent Wallace's local area network in the Caldwell Executive Suite. I proved aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. I established the third folder, tagging it with a vibrant yellow marker. This section held the international money laundering. I dropped the offshore routing hashes into the directory. I attached the corporate registry documents for Vanguard Horizon. I highlighted the Caribbean Shell Company's status as a monitored federal honeypot. I included the active Federal Bureau of Investigation red notices, proving Vincent funneled the stolen $50 million through a recognized securities fraud syndicate. Finally, I compiled the fourth folder, marking it with a bright toxic green tab. This housed the disbursement and complicity. I populated the folder with Serena's staggering financial trail. I paired every single credit card receipt with the corresponding geotagged social media photograph. I bound the stolen capital to her physical possessions, proving the Caldwell family knowingly utilized fraudulently obtained liquidity for personal, egregious enrichment. The dossier functioned as a masterpiece of forensic accounting. I reviewed the final structure. The logic flowed flawlessly, cascading from the initial physical break-in to the ultimate squandering of the laundered capital. It left zero ambiguity. It eliminated any possibility of Vincent claiming ignorance or placing the blame solely on a rogue chief financial officer. The color-coded tabs painted a vivid, inescapable portrait of a rotting corporate empire, sustained entirely by federal crimes and familial betrayal. I initiated a military-grade encryption sequence, locking the master dossier behind a rolling cryptographic hash. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, interlacing my fingers and stretching my shoulders. The heavy, overcast sky outside my penthouse window cast the room in a cool, gray light. It was Thursday evening. The frenetic energy of the past 48 hours settled into a deep, glacial calm. The trap possessed perfect tension. Vincent Caldwell held the stolen $50 million in his corporate vault. Serena wore the stolen diamonds around her neck. Trent Wallace walked through the executive suite believing he executed a flawless covert operation. They prepared for the Friday Christmas gala, convinced they secured their survival, eager to look Alistair Thorne in the eye and finalize the institutional bailout. They prepared to celebrate. I prepared to detonate. I stood up from the workstation and walked toward the master bedroom. I needed to select the charcoal gray shift dress from the closet. Vincent demanded I arrive looking like a subservient, middle-class failure. He wanted an empty wallet to contrast against his overflowing vault. I intended to give him exactly the aesthetic he requested, perfectly camouflaged, carrying an invisible match into his house of dry, rotting wood. The maitre d' guided me through the dimly lit labyrinth of mahogany tables and tufted leather booths. A haze of roasted garlic and seared meat hung heavy in the warm air of the exclusive Manhattan steakhouse. It was Thursday evening. The physical environment projected an aggressive, carnivorous masculinity, a fitting arena for my father's preferred method of psychological control. I spotted them occupying a secluded, semicircular booth near the back wall. Vincent Caldwell sat firmly in the center, his shoulders squared in a bespoke pinstripe suit, projecting the absolute illusion of financial supremacy. Beside him sat Serena, illuminated by the flickering glow of a table candle. I approached the booth wearing the charcoal gray shift dress. Vincent did not stand to greet me. His eyes swept over my unbranded clothing, his jaw tightening in an immediate, visceral display of disappointment. "You wore that," Vincent stated, driving the words forward like a blunt instrument. "Good evening, Vincent," I replied. I slid into the leather booth opposite them, placing my simple leather handbag on the seat beside me. I smoothed the cloth napkin over my lap, keeping my posture impeccably straight. "I explicitly told you to purchase something presentable for tomorrow," Vincent continued, his voice maintaining a low, punishing register designed to strip away confidence. "Tomorrow is the Caldwell Christmas Gala. Alistair Thorne will command the head table. I cannot have you hovering around the perimeter looking like a struggling administrative assistant." "I find this garment perfectly functional," I said, keeping my tone entirely devoid of defensive emotion. Vincent scoffed, picking up his heavy crystal wine glass. He swirled the dark, blood-red Cabernet, observing the legs of the liquid clinging to the glass. "Functionality is an excuse for those who cannot afford aesthetics. Piper, it is embarrassing." He waved a hand, dismissing my presence, and signaled a passing waiter. Vincent did not offer me a menu. He ordered a massive, dry-aged ribeye for himself, a fillet for Serena, and a generic chicken entree for me. He wielded his ordering power to establish immediate dominance, stripping me of agency over my own meal. I folded my hands on the pristine white tablecloth. I allowed him his petty victories. Serena shifted in her seat, leaning into the candlelight. The movement exposed her collarbone and the massive, diamond-encrusted tennis necklace resting against her skin. "You really should listen to Daddy, Piper," Serena chimed in, her voice coated in a thick, artificial sweetness. She reached up, tapping her manicured index finger against the heavy stones. The diamonds caught the ambient light, throwing sharp, fragmented reflections across the mahogany table. Presentation dictates value. If you look cheap, people treat you like a liability. I looked directly at the necklace. I did not see a luxury accessory. I saw a $65,000 transaction hash. I saw a localized debit originating from the Caldwell Brokerage corporate account at exactly 10:42 on Wednesday morning. I saw a geo-tagged social media upload confirming the purchase. That is a substantial piece of jewelry. "Serena?" I noted, my voice steady, projecting polite, oblivious curiosity. Serena smiled, a wide, triumphant expression. She tilted her chin upward. "It is an early holiday gift." Caldwell Brokerage secured a massive capital expansion this week. Daddy is expanding the legacy, and he believes the family should reflect that prosperity. Vincent nodded, cutting into a piece of warm bread, dragging it through a plate of olive oil. "We secured $50 million in fresh, unencumbered liquidity," Vincent announced. He leaned across the table. locking his eyes onto mine, desperately needing me to absorb the magnitude of his fabricated success. I outmaneuvered the entire market. While my competitors drown in toxic debt, I secured the capital required to solidify a partnership with Alistair Thorne. By tomorrow night, Caldwell Brokerage will dominate this sector. I lifted my water glass, letting the ice shift against the rim. I took a slow, deliberate sip. He chewed his bread, entirely oblivious to the reality that he was bragging to the exact architect of his liquidity. He sat across from the woman whose stolen Social Security number, forged income verifications, and hijacked biometric token funded the very expansion he currently weaponized against her. $50 million, I repeated, setting the glass down. That requires a staggering amount of flawless collateral. Vincent waved his steak knife dismissively. It requires vision, Piper, something you completely lack. Speaking of which, how is your little computer repair gig going? Are you still typing code for that mid-level tech startup? He fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of modern finance. He believed wealth required shouting across trading floors and bullying subordinates. He possessed zero comprehension of the quantitative algorithmic structures that actually controlled global markets. My work remains highly consistent, I replied. The algorithms function exactly as designed. Algorithms. Vincent sneered, shaking his head. The waiter arrived, placing the heavy ceramic plates on the table. The smell of charred meat and melted butter filled the space. Vincent sliced into his ribeye, exposing the rare, bleeding center. You waste your life in a cubicle. You type invisible numbers into a machine and call it a career. You possess no tangible assets. You own nothing. He pointed the tip of his steak knife directly at my chest. I will give you a piece of financial advice. Piper, Vincent said, chewing his food. Go to a bank tomorrow morning. Take out a commercial loan. Borrow $10,000 against whatever meager retirement account you possess. Hire a stylist and buy a gown that does not scream middle-class struggle. Consider it an investment in your own survival. If you embarrass me in front of Thorne tomorrow, I will have security escort you out the service elevator. The dramatic irony crested, towering over the table like a tidal wave waiting to crash. He instructed me to walk into a bank and take out a loan. He delivered this advice 24 hours after he orchestrated a $50 million federal bank fraud using my stolen identity. He sat chewing premium beef, surrounded by luxury, funded entirely by a radioactive financial pipeline he dragged through an internationally monitored money laundering syndicate. I did not clench my jaw. I did not drive my fork into the table. I absorbed his condescension with a glacial, unbothered calm. I appreciate the advice, Vincent, I said, slicing a small piece of my chicken. However, I maintain a strict policy regarding debt. I prefer to operate using only the capital I legitimately own. Leveraging assets you do not possess always ends in a catastrophic margin call. Vincent laughed, a harsh, abrasive bark. That cowardly mindset guarantees you will die penniless. Leverage is the foundation of empires. Serena laughed with him, pulling her sleeve back to expose a thick, platinum watch strapped to her wrist. Another stolen transaction. Another unearned asset. Look at your wrist, Piper, Serena mocked, pointing at my simple, black leather timepiece. You wear a $30 watch. I wear a $30,000 timepiece. You track the seconds. I own the time. I glanced at her platinum watch. I calculated the exact moment the Federal Bureau of Investigation would inventory it as seized criminal evidence. Time operates independently of the price tag. Serena, I replied evenly, placing a small piece of food in my mouth. It catches everyone eventually. The dinner stretched forward, a continuous grueling marathon of psychological warfare. Vincent dominated the conversation, detailing his grand strategy for the Friday Christmas gala. He planned a sprawling, decadent event in a hotel ballroom, culminating in a public toast where Alistair Thorne would officially sign the institutional bailout documents. Vincent required an audience to witness his coronation. He needed the Wall Street elite to watch him conquer the financial collapse. I sat quietly, sipping sparkling water, chewing my food, and absorbing every single detail of his impending schedule. I did not interrupt his monologues. I played the role of the subdued, defeated daughter to absolute perfection. Vincent believed he controlled the narrative. He believed he successfully stripped away my confidence, reducing me to a silent prop destined to fade into the background of his victory lap. He looked at my charcoal gray dress and saw surrender. He failed to realize that true power does not roar over a steak dinner. True power sits in silence, compiling routing hashes, extracting surveillance footage, and arming a digital explosive device. I watched my father wipe a drop of red wine from his chin. I watched my sister adjust her stolen diamonds. I smiled pleasantly, knowing I held the digital guillotine poised directly over their necks. The execution required only a few more hours of patience. Friday morning broke over Manhattan, bringing a heavy leaden sky that threatened snow inside my penthouse. The climate remained a sterile 68 degrees. I bypassed the kitchen and walked directly into my home office. The 6-monitor array cast a stark, white glow across the glass desk. I sat in my ergonomic chair and struck the mechanical keys, initiating the final boot sequence. Today, Caldwell Brokerage died. I unlocked the air-gapped server. The master encrypted folder labeled Caldwell Execution rested on the desktop. I opened the directory, running a final forensic audit on the contents to guarantee maximum destructive yield. The structure remained flawless. The first tier contained the physical breach, the high-definition surveillance video capturing Trent Wallace tearing through my bookshelves, stealing the titanium biometric token. The second tier held the digital forgery, the falsified commercial loan applications bearing my stolen Social Security number, paired with the fabricated income verification letters. The third tier mapped the financial treason, the complete routing history, tracing the $50 million from the underwriter's escrow through the Delaware clearinghouse and directly into the radioactive Caribbean shell company known as Vanguard Horizon. Finally, the fourth tier bound the stolen capital to personal greed, documenting Serena's massive luxury spending spree across the city. I did not reach for my cellular device. I did not dial a 3-digit emergency code to summon local police. A precinct detective would observe offshore routing hashes and file the report into an overflowing cabinet, treating a massive financial conspiracy as a standard property dispute. Vincent possessed the resources to bury a localized investigation in endless corporate litigation. I intended to bypass the infantry entirely. I called directly for an orbital strike. I opened a heavily encrypted, untraceable communication tunnel. I bypassed public internet service providers, bouncing my signal through a series of offshore proxy servers until my origin point became entirely invisible. I targeted the secure intake portals for the premier financial law enforcement agencies in the United States. I inputted the digital address for the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I added the enforcement division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I did not submit the dossier as a standard civilian tip. Federal agencies receive thousands of irrelevant complaints daily. To ensure immediate, catastrophic intervention, I structured the submission utilizing the precise terminology of a high-level institutional risk assessment. I attached a priority flag to the metadata. I labeled the transmission active, critical threat to institutional banking infrastructure, imminent laundering of cartel-linked capital. I explicitly named Alistair Thorne's bank as the impending target of the fraudulent $50 million. I highlighted the timeline. I detailed Vincent's plan to officially slide the fabricated balance sheets across a table and integrate the radioactive capital into a legitimate institutional bank at his Christmas gala this very evening. This specific detail transformed a past financial crime into an active, ticking contagion. The federal authorities could not afford to wait. If Thorne's bank absorbed those tainted funds, the regulatory fallout would trigger a massive sector collapse. They possessed no choice but to intercept the transaction tonight. I pressed the return key. The progress bar illuminated my center monitor. The encrypted data packets compressed, segmented, and plunged into the fiber optic network. The transmission completed in exactly 8 seconds. I did not close the terminal. I launched a proprietary monitoring script designed to track the destination servers. I demanded visual confirmation of the detonation. I sat back, interlacing my fingers, and watched the raw access logs populate the screen. 14 minutes passed in absolute silence. The only sound in the penthouse was the low hum of the cooling fans housed in the server rack. Then, a sharp, green notification pinged on the monitor. A server located within a federal building in Lower Manhattan accessed the file. 2 minutes later, a second node triggered. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened the dossier. The traffic multiplied exponentially. Internet protocol addresses belonging to specialized tactical divisions and federal forensic accounting units swarmed the encrypted document. I visualized the reaction inside those windowless federal conference rooms. Highly trained agents stared at their monitors, dissecting the indisputable proof. They watched Trent Wallace steal the key. They analyzed the forged loan documents. They tracked the $50 million flowing directly through an internationally flagged money laundering syndicate. They reviewed Serena flaunting the stolen diamonds. The puzzle required zero assembly. I provided the completed picture, bound in digital iron. The federal machinery possesses immense weight. Once activated, it operates with crushing, unstoppable velocity. They required a few hours to secure the necessary warrants from a federal judge, coordinate the tactical teams, and brief the strike commanders. The timing aligned perfectly with Vincent's schedule. He intended to host his Christmas gala in a luxury hotel ballroom. He planned to stand before 400 Wall Street elites, raise a glass of expensive champagne, and present the stolen $50 million to Alistair Thorne. He built a towering stage to celebrate his own genius. He constructed the exact venue required for a spectacular, globally publicized arrest. The access logs confirmed the total download of the dossier by 5 separate federal branches. I severed the connection to the portals and wiped the temporary cache from my terminal. The digital explosive device sat armed and buried directly beneath the foundation of Caldwell Brokerage. The fuse burned silently, counting down to the evening. I stood up from the glass desk and walked toward my closet. I needed to prepare for the gala. Vincent commanded my attendance. He demanded I stand quietly in his shadow, a symbol of mediocrity, while he claimed his fabricated victory. I reached for the simple, elegant black dress I selected for the evening. I would grant him his audience. I would step into the glittering ballroom, hold a glass of water, and watch him scale the absolute pinnacle of his towering arrogance. The digital fuse was already burning quietly, hidden deep within the dark cables. I would stand in the back, silent and untraceable, and wait for the sparks. The execution required only a few more hours of patience. The heavy mahogany doors of the Manhattan luxury hotel ballroom swung open, unleashing a wave of orchestrated opulence. I stepped across the threshold, leaving the freezing, bitter wind of late December 2010 isolated on the city streets behind me. Hundreds of crystal prisms fractured the light from 3 massive chandeliers suspended above the polished marble floor. A string quartet positioned on a raised velvet platform played a sharp, driving classical arrangement, their bows moving in aggressive synchronization. Waiters in crisp white jackets navigated the dense crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and imported caviar. The room hummed with the concentrated, predatory energy of the Wall Street elite. 400 guests occupied the space, a congregation of hedge fund managers, commercial underwriters, and corporate executives. They gathered to celebrate the end of a volatile fiscal year, cloaking their ruthless ambition in tailored wool and holiday pleasantries. I bypassed the coat check and glided silently along the perimeter of the ballroom. I wore the simple, unbranded black dress I selected from my closet that morning. I wore no jewelry. I carried a plain leather clutch. I blended seamlessly into the shadows cast by the towering marble pillars flanking the walls, achieving total camouflage amidst a sea of glittering emerald gowns and ostentatious diamond displays. A waiter passed my position. I reached out, retrieving a simple glass of sparkling water, and anchored myself near a structural column. I possessed a flawless, unobstructed view of the grand stage. Vincent Caldwell occupied the exact center of the ballroom. He did not merely stand in the room, he attempted to command the fundamental gravity of the space. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo. The fabric cut a sharp, imposing silhouette, meticulously tailored to project absolute financial supremacy. He gripped the shoulder of a rival executive, throwing his head back in a booming, theatrical laugh that echoed over the string quartet. Vincent radiated a blinding, manufactured confidence. He believed he secured his legacy. He believed the $50 million resting in the Caldwell Brokerage corporate accounts shielded him from the catastrophic margin calls threatening to obliterate his firm. He operated under the terminal delusion that his morning break-in, his forged digital signatures, and his offshore money laundering scheme remained an impenetrable secret. I watched him signal a waiter, exchanging his empty glass for a fresh pour of champagne. He turned to face a circle of investors, gesturing expansively with his free hand. He pitched his vision of an expanding empire, leveraging the stolen capital to construct a facade of unassailable liquidity. He built a towering monument to his own genius, entirely oblivious to the federal crosshairs painted squarely on his chest. Trent Wallace hovered exactly 2 paces behind Vincent's right shoulder. The chief financial officer wore a stark black suit, clutching a thick, leather-bound portfolio against his ribs. Inside that portfolio rested the partnership agreements, the physical contracts designed to bind Caldwell Brokerage to Alistair Thorne's top-tier institutional bank. I analyzed Trent's body language. He projected a veneer of corporate dominance, but the microscopic physiological responses betrayed him. A fine sheen of sweat gathered at his hairline. He shifted his weight continuously from one polished shoe to the other. His eyes darted toward the mahogany entrance doors every few seconds. Trent executed the physical theft of my biometric token. He possessed an intimate, visceral connection to the federal crimes they committed. The stolen $50 million burned a hole in his ledger, and he desperately required Thorne's signature to legitimize the fraud. Across the room, Serena functioned as the physical manifestation of their treason. My half-sister stood near the main bar, surrounded by a sycophantic circle of junior executives. She wore a crimson silk gown that dragged elegantly across the marble floor. The heavy, diamond-encrusted tennis necklace rested against her collarbone, catching the light from the chandeliers and throwing sharp, fractured reflections across the faces of her audience. I stared at the diamonds. I did not see compressed carbon. I saw the exact $65,000 transaction hash I tracked on Wednesday morning. I saw the geotagged digital evidence currently sitting on a secure server inside a federal law enforcement facility. Serena threw her head back, laughing at a joke, raising her glass to toast her own fabricated aristocracy. She squandered the stolen capital to purchase the admiration of strangers, actively twisting the rope that would hang her entire family. The atmosphere in the ballroom thickened, pulling tight like a coiled steel spring. The ambient chatter escalated in volume. I checked my simple leather watch. The federal machinery activated hours ago. The white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the enforcement agents of the Securities and Exchange Commission possessed the complete, unredacted master dossier. They reviewed the high-definition surveillance footage. They traced the offshore routing numbers straight through the Caribbean honeypot. They secured the necessary warrants from a federal judge. The tactical teams mobilized. They navigated the gridlocked streets of Manhattan, closing the distance to this exact luxury hotel. The execution required only a final shred of patience. A sudden shift in the crowd's momentum broke my concentration. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance swung open, held by 2 uniformed hotel staff members. Alistair Thorne crossed the threshold. The managing director of the institutional bank did not swagger. He did not project the loud, desperate energy of my father. Thorne moved with the quiet, devastating assurance of old money and absolute institutional power. He wore a classic, unembellished tuxedo, his silver hair combed sharply back. He commanded billions in legitimate, unencumbered liquidity. Vincent spotted Thorne immediately. The booming laugh died in his throat. He abandoned his circle of investors, abandoning his drink on a passing tray, and marched rapidly toward the entrance to intercept his target. "Alistair," Vincent shouted, projecting his voice over the swelling music. He extended both hands, grasping Thorne's right hand in an aggressive, dominant handshake. "Welcome. The evening is finally complete. I secured the private table near the podium for us. We have much to celebrate tonight." Thorne accepted the handshake, though his expression remained a mask of polite, impenetrable diplomacy. He nodded briefly to Vincent, scanning the opulent ballroom. A formidable gathering, Vincent. You certainly spare no expense. A reflection of the Caldwell legacy. Alistair, Vincent replied, releasing Thorne's hand and gesturing toward the grand stage erected at the far end of the room. And a reflection of the $50 million in fresh capital we secured this week. Our balance sheet is immaculate. Caldwell Brokerage stands ready to dominate the upcoming fiscal year. Trent has the partnership documents ready for your review. Trent Wallace stepped forward, producing the leather-bound portfolio. He offered Thorne a tight, strained smile. I gripped my glass of sparkling water. The dramatic irony saturated the air, heavy and suffocating. Vincent blatantly bragged about the stolen $50 million directly to the man he intended to defraud. He presented a radioactive financial pipeline as a pristine corporate asset. Thorne did not reach for the portfolio. He simply offered a curt nod, clasping his hands behind his back. I look forward to reviewing the final architecture of your liquidity. Vincent, I prefer to understand exactly who underwrites the ground I stand on. Of course, Vincent agreed enthusiastically, completely failing to detect the subtle, razor-sharp edge hidden within Thorne's vocabulary. He placed a hand on Thorne's shoulder, physically steering the managing director toward the reserved seating at the front of the room. The string quartet transitioned into a sweeping, triumphant crescendo. The waiters moved rapidly through the crowd, pouring the final rounds of vintage champagne, preparing the audience for the impending speeches. Vincent ascended the short staircase leading to the grand stage. He stepped behind the polished mahogany podium, tapping the microphone twice. The sharp percussive thumps echoed through the surround sound speakers, instantly slicing through the ambient noise of the ballroom. 400 Wall Street elites ceased their conversations. They turned their attention to the stage. Serena moved to the front row, adjusting her stolen diamonds, positioning herself perfectly for the photographers. Trent Wallace stood rigidly near the stairs, clutching the contracts against his chest. I remained anchored to the marble pillar in the shadows of the perimeter. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the cold, sparkling water. The ice chilled my throat. I lowered the glass, locking my eyes onto my father. Vincent adjusted his bow tie. He looked out over the sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits, absorbing the silence. He believed he reached the absolute pinnacle of his towering arrogance. He prepared to deliver his victory speech, completely blind to the fact that the grand stage beneath his feet was already a hollow shell, waiting for the very first crack to shatter his entire world into dust. Vincent gripped the edges of the polished mahogany podium. He leaned into the microphone, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom to stretch. 400 members of the Wall Street elite stared up at the stage. Their champagne flutes paused in midair. "Survival," Vincent began, his voice resonating through the towering surround sound speakers, "is a metric reserved for the mediocre." He projected the word with absolute, booming authority. He released his right hand from the podium, gesturing expansively across the sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering emerald gowns. We stand at the close of December 2010. We navigated the radioactive fallout of the 2008 financial collapse, while our competitors drowned in toxic debt. Caldwell Brokerage did not merely survive, we conquered. Vincent paused, absorbing the scattered, polite applause rippling through the front tables. He sought the gaze of Alistair Thorne, ensuring the managing director witnessed his manufactured supremacy. Thorne sat perfectly still at the premier table, his hands folded, offering a blank, impenetrable expression. "This week, we secured $50 million in fresh, unencumbered liquidity," Vincent announced, driving the fraudulent number into the room like a steel spike. "We built a fortress. We secured the legacy of this firm for the next century. But a legacy requires more than capital. It requires ruthless, uncompromising vision." Vincent scanned the perimeter of the ballroom. His eyes swept past the crystal chandeliers, past the white-gloved waiters, and pierced the shadows cast by the marble structural columns. He found my position. He locked onto the simple black dress blending into the darkness, a sharp predatory spark ignited in his eyes. He abandoned his prepared remarks. The teleprompter scrolling quietly at the base of the podium became irrelevant. Vincent possessed a captive audience of 400 industry titans, and he decided to weaponize that audience. He required a foil. He needed a prop to elevate his towering ego, and he selected his eldest daughter for the sacrifice. "Vision," Vincent repeated, his tone dropping into a lower, mocking register. He raised his hand, pointing his index finger directly at my shadow. "Vision is a rare commodity. Some possess it. Others remain completely blind to the world turning around them." The physical dynamic of the ballroom shifted instantly. Hundreds of heads pivoted in unison, following the trajectory of his finger. The collective gaze of the Wall Street elite landed squarely on me. The heavy silence amplified. The guests scrutinized my unbranded clothing, my lack of jewelry, and my absolute stillness. "Stand in the light, Piper," Vincent commanded over the microphone. The instruction carried the punishing weight of a patriarch demanding total subjugation. I did not retreat into the corridor. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. Crossing the threshold of the shadow and entering the harsh glare of the overhead chandeliers, I kept my posture impeccably straight. I held the glass of sparkling water in my right hand. The ice clinked softly against the rim, the only sound registering in my immediate vicinity. "My daughter, ladies and gentlemen," Vincent announced, his voice dripping with theatrical condescension, a perfect study in contrast. He gripped the podium again, leaning forward, turning the corporate gala into a public execution. "I spend my days architecting the future of global finance. I move capital that shapes industries. Piper spends her days sitting in a windowless cubicle, typing invisible code for a forgettable tech startup. She possesses no ambition. She refuses to understand the mechanics of power." A low, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the back of the room. A few executives shifted their weight, exchanging nervous glances, recognizing the brutal, unorthodox nature of the public humiliation. Vincent ignored the shifting atmosphere. He fed on the discomfort. He required total domination. "We offered her every advantage," Vincent continued, adopting the tone of a deeply burdened, benevolent benefactor. "We attempted to teach her the value of presentation, of leverage, of legacy. She rejected it all. She prefers her mediocre existence. In fact, if Caldwell Brokerage did not operate with such immense surplus, she would likely find herself on the street. I continually subsidize her failures. I finance her quiet, uninspired life just to keep the Caldwell name clear of absolute embarrassment." He blatantly lied. He stood on a stage funded by my stolen Social Security number and claimed he subsidized my existence. He orchestrated a $50 million federal bank fraud, using my pristine credit to save his rotting empire. And he possessed the staggering audacity to frame me as a financial parasite. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the tense murmuring of the crowd. Serena laughed. My half-sister sat in the front row, inches away from Alistair Thorne. She threw her head back, letting a loud, theatrical laugh echo against the vaulted ceilings. She raised her crystal flute in a mocking salute, her crimson silk gown pooling around her chair. She reached up with her free hand, tapping her fingers against the $65,000 diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. She flaunted the stolen capital. She validated his cruelty. She absorbed the spotlight, projecting the image of the successful, aristocratic air contrasting the broken, middle-class failure. Trent Wallace hovered near the stairs of the stage. The chief financial officer wiped a drop of sweat from his temple. He clutched the leather-bound portfolio against his chest. Trent recognized the danger. He understood they danced on a razor wire, possessing stolen capital, waiting for Thorne to sign the partnership documents. He wanted Vincent to finalize the deal, not antagonize a family member, but Trent lacked the authority to stop the runaway train. Vincent soaked in Serena's laughter. It fueled the final ascent of his ego. "The financial markets do not tolerate weakness," Vincent declared, building toward his crescendo. He gripped his champagne flute, lifting it toward the ceiling. "This industry is a wilderness. It requires predators. It requires men and women willing to seize opportunity and crush the obsolete. He looked directly into my eyes. The microphone picked up the sharp intake of his breath. In a world of wolves, Piper. Vincent sneered, delivering the final, devastating blow. You are nothing but a sheep with an empty wallet. The insult hung in the chilled air of the ballroom. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I did not turn on my heel and flee the room in tears. I stood perfectly rooted to the marble floor. I held the crystal glass steady. The water inside remained completely placid, mirroring the absolute, glacial calm gripping my nervous system. I catalogued his words. I logged the laughter of my sister. I recorded the silence of the 400 executives. I evaluated the psychological battlefield. Vincent successfully compressed the spring to its absolute maximum tension. He built a towering, magnificent monument to his own arrogance. He scaled the peak, raised his flag, and demanded the entire world acknowledge his supremacy. He tied his entire identity, his reputation, and his freedom to the illusion of his $50 million triumph. I waited. I did not need to shout. I did not need to defend my bank accounts or list my algorithmic achievements. Engaging a narcissist in a shouting match merely validates their premise. True power dictates the environment. It never reacts to it. I watched the second hand sweep across the dial of my simple leather watch. The federal warrants possessed active signatures. The tactical teams navigated the final city blocks. The trap reached the absolute threshold of detonation. I offered Vincent Caldwell a slow, chilling smile. I raised my glass of sparkling water a fraction of an inch, accepting his toast. I permitted him to enjoy the final 10 seconds of his fabricated reign, waiting for the exact moment the concrete foundation beneath his stage shattered into dust. Vincent hoisted his crystal champagne flute toward the vaulted ceiling. The golden liquid caught the light of the chandeliers, sparkling with the fabricated promise of his impending victory. He turned his body slightly, extending his free hand toward the premier table situated directly beneath the stage. To the Caldwell legacy, Vincent announced, his voice vibrating with absolute triumph. And to our esteemed guest, Alistair Thorne, may this evening mark the beginning of a flawless, enduring partnership. He expected Thorne to stand, raise his glass in mutual agreement, and seal the $50 million illusion before the assembled Wall Street elite. He expected the crowd to erupt into thunderous applause, validating his manufactured supremacy. Alistair Thorne did stand. However, he did not reach for his champagne. Thorne pushed his heavy mahogany chair backward. The wooden legs scraped sharply against the polished marble, producing a harsh, grating sound that sliced through the ambient murmurs of the ballroom. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket with deliberate, unhurried precision. He stepped away from the premier table and walked directly toward the stairs of the grand stage. Trent Wallace recognized the deviation from the script. The chief financial officer stepped forward, intercepting Thorne at the base of the stairs. Trent offered the leather-bound portfolio, presenting a gold-plated pen resting atop the partnership contracts. He smiled, a frantic, desperate expression stretching across his sweating face. Thorne did not break his stride. He lifted his right hand, waving the portfolio away with a flick of his wrist. He bypassed Trent entirely, ascending the short staircase and stepping onto the stage. Vincent's confident posture faltered. His smile tightened into a rigid, uncertain line. He lowered his champagne flute a fraction of an inch, shifting his weight as Thorne approached the podium. "Alistair," Vincent murmured, stepping aside slightly, offering the microphone. "The floor is yours." Thorne accepted the position. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, anchoring his weight. He did not look at Vincent. He looked out over the sea of 400 executives, hedge fund managers, and commercial underwriters. The room plunged into a suffocating, absolute silence. The attendees sensed the atmospheric pressure drop. They lowered their glasses. They ceased their breathing. "Vincent speaks of wolves and sheep," Thorne began. His voice lacked the booming, desperate theatricality of my father's delivery. Thorne spoke with the heavy, crushing gravity of a man who commanded legitimate billions. "He speaks of survival, of conquering the volatile markets of 2010. He claims Caldwell Brokerage possesses the vision required to dominate this sector. Thorne paused. He turned his head slowly, locking his piercing gaze directly onto Vincent. "Vincent, you fundamentally misunderstand the architecture of our industry," Thorne stated. "Institutional banking requires absolute, uncompromising transparency. We do not underwrite illusions. We do not partner with ghosts." Vincent's chest hitched. He clutched the stem of his crystal flute, his knuckles turning stark white. He attempted to maintain his arrogant facade, but a visible tremor seized his jaw. Thorne turned his attention back to the silent crowd. "Caldwell Brokerage holds a 40-to-1 leverage ratio," Thorne announced, broadcasting the catastrophic internal metrics to the entire ballroom. Their debt maturity schedules dictate a $75 million balloon payment due before the end of this fiscal year. They possess zero unencumbered capital. Their ledgers run thick with toxic commercial real estate loans and subprime remnants wrapped in fraudulent valuations. By every metric recognized by the Securities and Exchange Commission, this firm is financially deceased. A collective, audible gasp rippled across the 400 guests. The Wall Street elite recoil from insolvency like a physical contagion. The executives standing nearest to the stage physically stepped backward, creating a widening perimeter of isolation around the Caldwell family. "Alistair, what are you doing?" Vincent hissed, his voice cracking, leaning toward the microphone. "We secured $50 million this week. I showed you the preliminary balance sheets. The liquidity sits in our accounts right now." Thorne did not yield the podium. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice turning to sharpened steel. "You presented a balance sheet reflecting $50 million in fresh capital." Thorne agreed. "A sudden, miraculous deposit routed through a Caribbean shell company. You invited me here to secure a lifeline, leveraging that mysterious liquidity to solicit an institutional bailout from my bank." Thorne removed his hands from the podium. He stepped away from the microphone stand. Closing the physical distance between himself and the edge of the stage, he looked past the front tables, past the crystal chandeliers, and found my shadow anchored against the marble structural column. "My institution does not issue capital blindly," Thorne declared, his voice carrying perfectly across the dead, silent room. "We consult our primary liquidity provider before authorizing any massive corporate expansion. We rely on the architect who engineered the quantitative algorithms stabilizing our entire offshore portfolio. I brought those fabricated balance sheets directly to my backer." Thorne extended his right arm, pointing his index finger squarely at me. "Allow me to introduce the sole owner of that shadow entity," Thorne announced, dropping the ultimate catastrophic bombshell. "The apex algorithmic architect whose proprietary infrastructure holds the capital underwriting my entire bank. The billionaire who single-handedly dictates the survival of Caldwell Brokerage." Thorne locked eyes with Vincent, delivering the final execution strike. "The very woman you just called a sheep with an empty wallet, Ms. Piper." The information gap snapped shut with bone-crushing velocity. Vincent Caldwell's reality evaporated, the towering monument to his own arrogance. The empire he built on toxic leverage and psychological abuse instantly shattered into microscopic dust. His eyes widened, bulging against his skull as his brain desperately attempted to process the impossible mathematics of his destruction. He stared at me, standing quietly in my unbranded black dress. He realized the middle-class failure he relentlessly mocked commanded the institutional bank he begged for survival. He realized he paraded his $50 million fraud directly in front of the exact predator who controlled the financial grid. The physical collapse of his ego manifested immediately. Vincent's fingers went completely slack. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his grip. It plummeted to the stage, shattering violently against the hardwood floor. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking glass echoed through the silent ballroom, showering his bespoke leather shoes with vintage wine and jagged shards. He staggered backward, his knees buckling. He collided heavily with the mahogany podium, grasping the wooden edges to prevent himself from crashing to the floor. His complexion morphed into a sickly, translucent gray. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. He opened his mouth, gasping for oxygen, but his lungs refused to expand. Below the stage, the fallout struck the accomplices. Trent Wallace dropped the leather-bound portfolio. The heavy binder hit the marble floor, the partnership contract spilling out, scattering uselessly across the tiles. Trent turned his back on the stage, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany exit doors, recognizing the terminal velocity of their exposed treason. Serena sat paralyzed in the front row. The sycophantic junior executives surrounding her immediately backed away, severing their social proximity to the disgraced heir. She raised her trembling hands, clutching the $65,000 diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. The color vanished from her cheeks. She stared at me through the harsh glare of the chandeliers, her jaw unhinged, comprehending the absolute obliteration of her fabricated aristocratic identity. I stood perfectly still in the perimeter shadows. I did not raise my voice, I did not gloat. I held my glass of sparkling water steady. I offered Vincent a cold, terrifying smile. The dramatic irony reached its absolute, devastating zenith. 400 elite guests pivoted their collective gaze away from the stage and stared directly at me. They looked at my simple clothing, completely reevaluating the quiet woman they previously dismissed. The murmured insults traded seconds prior transformed into expressions of profound awe and deep, instinctual fear. They turned their attention back to Vincent. The awe morphed instantly into unadulterated disgust. The Wall Street elite smelled the blood in the water. They looked at the CEO of Caldwell Brokerage and saw a pathetic, fraudulent corpse. He stood humiliated, financially obliterated, and entirely dependent on the daughter he publicly degraded. Vincent stared down at the shattered crystal surrounding his feet. He believed he reached the absolute bottom of his nightmare. He believed the public revelation of his insolvency constituted the ultimate punishment. He had no idea that this public execution of his name was merely the curtain raiser, and that a far more brutal, physical cage was already closing in on him. The silence within the luxury ballroom fractured into 1,000 venomous whispers. 400 members of the Wall Street elite actively digested the revelation, their collective gaze dissecting the man standing frozen on the grand stage. The atmospheric pressure inside the room crushed inward. Vincent Caldwell remained anchored behind the polished mahogany podium, staring blankly at the shattered crystal and spilled champagne pooling around his bespoke leather shoes. He opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a rebuttal, a defense, or even a coherent sentence. His vocal cords refused to engage. His brain severed the connection to his jaw. The psychological devastation struck him with the velocity of a physical impact, obliterating his arrogant smirk and leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Alistair Thorne did not linger on the stage to observe the carnage. The managing director turned his back on my father, dismissing him with the clinical detachment of a surgeon abandoning a terminal patient. Thorne descended the short wooden staircase, merging seamlessly back into the crowd of executives. The elite guests parted to allow Thorne passage, aligning themselves instantly with the legitimate billionaire and severing all ties to the exposed fraud. Vincent stood entirely alone under the harsh glare of the overhead spotlights. Below the stage, the blast radius extended outward, instantly incinerating the social currency of his accomplices. Serena sat rigidly in the front row, her crimson silk gown pooling around her chair. The sycophantic junior executives who flanked her all evening executed a rapid, synchronized retreat. They physically stepped backward, turning their shoulders away from her, creating a stark, empty perimeter around her table. The proximity to a disgraced, insolvent family constituted professional suicide in their industry. Serena raised her trembling hands, pressing her palms tightly against her mouth. The blood drained completely from her face, transforming her complexion into a sickly, translucent ash. Her wide, panicked eyes darted across the room, searching for a familiar face, a sympathetic nod, or a shred of validation. She found nothing but profound, undisguised disgust. She lowered her hands, her fingers catching the edge of the $65,000 diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. The heavy stones, purchased entirely with stolen capital, no longer projected aristocratic wealth. They functioned as a glittering, undeniable shackle. Serena gasped for air, her chest heaving as her fabricated identity disintegrated in real time. She squandered my hijacked liquidity to purchase her throne, and she now sat paralyzed in the ruins of her own unmitigated greed. Near the edge of the seating area, Trent Wallace operated on the pure, desperate instinct of a cornered animal. The chief financial officer did not look at Vincent. He did not attempt to retrieve the leather-bound portfolio or the partnership contracts scattered across the marble tiles. Trent recognized the terminal trajectory of the evening. He knew the $50 million sitting in their corporate accounts originated from a forged commercial loan. He knew he personally executed the morning break-in to steal the biometric token. Trent turned away from the grand stage, lowering his chin, attempting to shrink his physical footprint. He navigated the perimeter of the ballroom, hugging the shadows cast by the structural pillars, mirroring the exact camouflage I utilized mere minutes prior. He moved with a rapid, frantic urgency, his expensive black suit blending into the darkness. He intended to abandon Vincent, abandon the firm, and flee the hotel before the inevitable inquiries began. I watched Trent's progression from my position across the room. He reached the main entrance. Trent extended his hands, grasping the heavy brass handles of the towering mahogany doors. He pulled downward, throwing his body weight backward to swing the doors open and escape into the corridor. The brass handles engaged, but the heavy mahogany doors remained completely immobile. Trent grunted, adjusting his grip, his panic escalating into a fever pitch. He yanked the handles violently, the metal rattling against the wood. The doors held firm. Two broad-shouldered men wearing the dark, tailored uniforms of the hotel security staff stepped out from the alcove adjacent to the entrance. They did not speak. They did not offer an explanation. One guard stepped directly in front of Trent, crossing his arms over his chest, establishing a physical, impenetrable barricade. The other guard pointed a stern finger back toward the center of the ballroom, indicating the exact direction Trent needed to walk. The hotel management locked the perimeter. They secured the exits. Trent released the brass handles. He staggered backward, his hands falling limply to his sides. He looked at the locked mahogany doors, then turned slowly to survey the massive ballroom. He realized he possessed no exit. The physical trap mirrored the digital snare perfectly. He occupied a sealed container, trapped alongside the orchestrator of his impending doom. Back on the stage, the lack of oxygen forced Vincent into a physical retreat. He gripped the collar of his bespoke tuxedo shirt, his fingers clawing desperately at the silk bow tie constricting his throat. He yanked the fabric downward, tearing the top button loose. He required air, but his hyperventilating lungs refused to expand. The ambient chatter of the 400 guests morphed into a deafening, suffocating roar inside his skull. Vincent stumbled away from the mahogany podium. His polished leather shoe caught the edge of a shattered crystal shard, causing his ankle to roll. He pitched forward, losing his balance entirely. He caught himself on the wooden handrail of the stairs, gripping the timber with white-knuckled desperation. He descended the short staircase, his movements jerky, uncoordinated, and utterly stripped of his former arrogant grace. As Vincent reached the marble floor, the Wall Street elite executed a brutal, synchronized maneuver. The executives, the hedge fund managers, and the underwriters physically pulled back. They dragged their chairs away from the center aisle. They created a wide quarantine zone around my father, treating his proximity like a highly contagious, lethal pathogen. Vincent stumbled forward into the empty space. He looked around the ballroom, his chest heaving, his face slick with a heavy sheen of cold sweat. He searched for Thorne. He searched for an ally. He found 400 silent judges condemning him to absolute ruin. Then, his frantic, bloodshot eyes found the perimeter. He locked his gaze directly onto mine. I stood exactly where he left me. I maintained my impeccable posture in the simple black dress. I held the glass of sparkling water, the ice resting quietly at the bottom. I did not break eye contact. I offered him the exact devastating silence he utilized to belittle my existence for 3 decades. Across the expanse of the ballroom, the mathematical equation finally clicked into place inside Vincent Caldwell's brain. He stopped stumbling. He stood frozen in the center of the marble floor, his mind processing the impossible timeline of his own destruction. He thought about the forged commercial loan applications. He thought about the Tuesday morning break-in. He thought about the stolen titanium biometric token and the $50 million routed through the Caribbean Shell Company. He believed he executed a flawless, invisible heist against a naive, technologically illiterate target. Looking at my unblinking, glacial expression, Vincent realized the terrifying truth: I never missed the physical intrusion. I tracked the digital forgery from the exact moment Trent submitted the files. I watched the $50 million bounce across the transatlantic fiber optic network, logging every single internet protocol address. I monitored Serena liquidating the stolen capital across Manhattan, downloading her receipts and her social media uploads in real time. Vincent realized I did not merely discover his crime, I facilitated it. I allowed him to steal the money. I allowed him to inflate his balance sheet. I allowed him to schedule this lavish Christmas gala, invite his premier banking partner, and step onto a grand stage to brag about his fraudulent liquidity. I handed him the rope, measured the drop, and permitted him to secure the noose around his own neck. He stared at his quiet, unassuming daughter. He looked past the unbranded clothing and the simple leather handbag. He finally saw the apex algorithmic architect who commanded the institutional liquidity, underwriting his entire industry. He saw the predator who completely dismantled his life, his legacy, and his freedom with terrifying, objective mathematical precision. Vincent opened his mouth, attempting to speak my name, attempting to plead for a sliver of mercy. The words died instantly on his tongue. A low, agonizing groan escaped his lips instead. He dropped his chin to his chest, his shoulders collapsing inward, entirely crushed by the astronomical weight of his own miscalculation. The atmosphere inside the ballroom reached a point of maximum, unbearable compression. The music remained dead. The guests remained silent. The exits remained locked. Vincent stood in the ruins of his empire, waiting for the final blow. As he collapsed inward under the crushing weight of his monumental error, the faint, wailing sound of sirens began to bleed through the heavy, frosted glass windows. The physical storm had officially arrived. A concussive impact shattered the suffocating silence of the luxury ballroom. The towering mahogany doors did not merely open, they breached. External force drove the heavy brass handles backward, slamming the massive wooden panels against the interior marble walls with a violent, deafening crack. The 2 hotel security guards who previously blocked the exit stumbled forward, entirely overwhelmed by the kinetic surge flooding the threshold. Outside the hotel, a fleet of tactical vehicles choked the Manhattan street. The frenetic, rotating strobes of the cruisers pierced the winter night. Violent flashes of crimson and cobalt light sliced through the tall, frosted glass windows flanking the ballroom entrance, painting the crystal chandeliers and the horrified faces of the Wall Street elite in alternating. Aggressive neon pulses. 24 heavily armed federal agents surged into the venue. They did not wear bespoke tuxedos. They wore thick, navy blue windbreakers emblazoned with the Stark. Yellow block letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with absolute, terrifying military synchronization. They bypassed the coat check, ignored the string quartet, and rapidly established a secure, impenetrable perimeter around the 400 guests. The atmosphere instantly transformed from an opulent corporate celebration into a hostile, locked-down crime scene. Trent Wallace occupied the space closest to the breached entrance. The chief financial officer recognized the Navy windbreakers. He understood the terminal reality of his situation. He turned his shoulders, attempting to shrink his physical profile and slip behind a marble structural column. A tactical agent intercepted him immediately. The agent stepped into Trent's path, driving a rigid forearm against his chest, halting his retreat. 2 additional agents flanked Trent, seizing his biceps with uncompromising force. They spun him around, driving his chest against the polished stone pillar. "Trent Wallace," an agent barked, retrieving a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Keep your hands visible." Across the ballroom, the lead special agent marched down the center aisle. He ignored the panicked murmurs of the hedge fund managers and the commercial underwriters. He fixed his gaze directly on the man standing paralyzed near the shattered crystal at the base of the grand stage. Vincent Caldwell remained entirely frozen. The rhythmic flashes of red and blue light washed over his face, highlighting the cold sweat coating his forehead. He watched the federal machinery converge on his position. His brain struggled to process the velocity of his destruction. Minutes ago, he commanded the room, bragging about $50 million in fresh liquidity. Now, he stood trapped, cornered by the undeniable consequences of his own hubris. The lead agent closed the distance. Stopping exactly 3 feet away from my father, he held a thick, sealed warrant folder in his left hand. "Vincent Caldwell," the lead agent announced, his voice projecting a deep, resonant authority that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "You are under immediate federal arrest." Vincent opened his mouth. He gasped, pulling shallow, ragged breaths into his restricted lungs. He raised a trembling hand, pointing weakly toward the stage, attempting to formulate a defense, an excuse, a coherent syllable. His vocal cords remained paralyzed. The agent did not wait for a response. He opened the folder, reading directly from the sworn affidavit I transmitted to their secure portal earlier that morning. "You are charged with multiple counts of massive, premeditated wire fraud," the agent declared, ensuring the 400 elite guests absorbed every single word. "You are charged with aggravated identity theft, severe corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering." A chorus of horrified gasps erupted from the surrounding tables. The executives who previously drank his champagne now stared at Vincent with unadulterated revulsion. "Furthermore," the agent continued, raising his voice to cut through the ambient shock, "we hold incontrovertible digital evidence proving you routed $50 million in fraudulently obtained capital through Vanguard Horizon, a blacklisted Caribbean syndicate currently monitored for active securities fraud. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Vincent did not comply. His knees buckled. His spine collapsed. 2 federal agents stepped forward, seizing Vincent by his shoulders. They physically turned him around, twisting his arms backward with practiced, clinical efficiency. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs clicked loudly over the sleeves of his bespoke wool tuxedo. The sound resonated with pure, definitive finality. The locking mechanism severed his fabricated supremacy, binding the chief executive officer of Caldwell Brokerage like a common, desperate thief. Below the stage, the federal sweep targeted the final accomplice. Serena sat completely paralyzed in her front row chair. The crimson silk gown dragged across the marble floor. She watched the agents shackle her father. She watched Trent Wallace dragged away from the pillar. She believed her physical distance from the corporate ledgers shielded her from the blast radius. A female federal agent approached her table, holding a clear, heavy-duty evidence bag. "Serena Caldwell," the agent stated, stopping beside her chair. Serena flinched, pulling her shoulders up to her ears. "I do not work for the brokerage," she stammered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, frantic whine. "I do not sign the documents. I do not know anything about a fraudulent loan." "We possess the transaction hashes for the stolen corporate capital," the agent replied, her tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "We possess the geo-tagged social media uploads matching those exact debits. Stand up." Serena shook her head, tears spilling over her eyelashes, ruining her meticulous makeup. She pressed her back against the chair, refusing to move. The agent did not negotiate. She reached down, grasping Serena by the upper arm, hauling her out of the chair. Serena stumbled, her expensive heels slipping on the polished floor. "The jewelry you currently wear represents the direct proceeds of federal wire fraud," the agent instructed. "Remove it immediately." Serena brought her hands to her collarbone, covering the $65,000 diamond tennis necklace. She clutched the heavy stones, her knuckles turning white. She refused to surrender the physical manifestation of her aristocratic delusion. She utilized my stolen identity to purchase the diamonds, and she intended to guard the theft to her absolute bitter end. "It is a gift," Serena shrieked, a visceral, desperate sound tearing from her throat. "It belongs to me." The agent did not issue a second warning. She stepped behind Serena, driving a knee into the back of her thigh to destabilize her balance. The agent reached around Serena's neck, her gloved fingers finding the platinum clasp. Serena thrashed, kicking her heels against the marble, screaming as the illusion of her wealth physically detached from her body. The agent unclasped the necklace. She pulled the heavy diamonds away from Serena's skin. Dropping the $65,000 accessory directly into the clear plastic evidence bag, she sealed the top, stripping the necklace of its glamour, reducing the luxury item to a sterile exhibit for a federal prosecution. Another agent stepped forward, securing Serena's wrists behind her back. Handcuffs clicked over her delicate skin. The crimson silk gown twisted and wrinkled as they locked her into compliance. The tactical commanders secured their targets. The execution transitioned into the extraction. "Move them out," the lead agent commanded. The federal agents formed a tight wedge, surrounding Vincent, Trent, and Serena. They initiated the perp walk. They did not utilize a discreet side exit or a service elevator. They marched the prisoners directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, parading them through the exact center of the Wall Street elite. The 400 guests parted, creating a wide, condemning corridor. The executives withdrew their smartphones, capturing the total, unmitigated disgrace of the Caldwell family. They recorded Trent Wallace staring at the floor. They recorded Serena sobbing hysterically, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. Finally, they recorded Vincent Caldwell. My father shuffled forward, his shoulders slumped, his chest heaving with every ragged breath. The handcuffs pulled his arms awkwardly behind his back, ruining the lines of his tailored suit. The flashing red and blue lights from the lobby washed over his pale, defeated face. As the federal escort reached the midpoint of the ballroom, Vincent lifted his head. His bloodshot eyes scanned the perimeter shadows. He found me. I remained anchored to the marble pillar. I wore my simple, unbranded black dress. I held my glass of sparkling water. I did not record him on a cellular device. I did not jeer. I did not offer a single ounce of gloating emotion. I looked at the man who spent 3 decades ridiculing my existence. I looked at the chief executive officer who hijacked my pristine identity to save his rotting empire. I looked at the father who called me a sheep with an empty wallet. I tilted my head a fraction of an inch. I offered him a slow, glacial stare, projecting the absolute, terrifying piece of an architect watching her demolition perform exactly according to the blueprint. Vincent broke eye contact. A fresh, silent tear leaked from the corner of his eye. Tracking down his cheek, he lowered his head, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of his error. He surrendered to the overwhelming gravity of the federal agents pulling him toward the exit. The heavy mahogany doors swallowed the Caldwell family, closing behind them with a definitive, hollow thud. The flashing lights faded from the frosted glass. The ballroom remained dead silent, the remaining guests paralyzed by the sheer velocity of the financial slaughter they just witnessed. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The ice chilled my throat. The public annihilation concluded flawlessly. I set my glass on a passing waiter's tray and turned toward the coat check. The federal authorities possessed physical custody, but the execution required one final conversation. I needed to visit a sterile, windowless room to deliver the absolute, concluding audit. The heavy steel door of the federal holding facility engaged with a hollow, reverberating thud, sealing the interrogation room from the chaotic kinetic energy of the processing center. The environment projected absolute, sterile hostility. Industrial fluorescent tubes buzzed relentlessly overhead, casting a harsh, shadowless glare across the concrete walls, and the scratched stainless steel table bolted directly to the linoleum floor. The air smelled of harsh chemical antiseptic and stale, recycled oxygen. Vincent Caldwell occupied a rigid metal chair on the far side of the table. He no longer resembled a titan of Wall Street. The federal intake process methodically stripped away his manufactured armor. The arresting agents confiscated his silk bow tie, his leather belt, and the shoelaces from his bespoke Oxfords. His midnight blue tuxedo jacket hung loosely over his slumped shoulders, deeply wrinkled and stained with dried champagne. He stared blankly at the metal surface, his wrists bound by heavy steel transport cuffs. His chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic tremors. I crossed the threshold, stepping into the frigid room. I wore the identical unbranded black dress from the ballroom. I moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, projecting an aura of undisturbed, absolute calm. Victoria, my powerhouse corporate attorney, flanked my right shoulder. She wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Victoria possessed a reputation for dismantling corrupt executives with ruthless, surgical litigation. She did not introduce herself. She did not offer a polite greeting. She pulled out a metal chair, sat beside me, and stared at Vincent with the cold, detached observation of an executioner verifying the identity of the condemned. Vincent lifted his head. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, surrounded by deep, bruised shadows. A chaotic web of burst capillaries mapped the sheer velocity of his psychological collapse. He looked at me, his jaw trembling, struggling to reconcile the quiet daughter he systematically abused with the apex predator who currently dictated his survival. "Piper," Vincent croaked, his voice fractured, entirely stripped of its booming, theatrical resonance. "Piper, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it's a misunderstanding. I am your father. I subsidized your entire life." He clung desperately to the decaying remnants of his delusion, even sitting in a federal interrogation room, chained to a bolted table. He attempted to deploy the exact same gaslighting tactics he utilized at the steakhouse. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I did not offer a single ounce of emotional validation. I reached into Victoria's open briefcase. I extracted the physical, printed copy of the master evidence file. I placed the thick, heavy stock binder onto the scratched steel surface. I pushed the portfolio across the table. It glided over the metal, stopping exactly 1 inch from his shackled hands. "I subsidized your entire existence, Vincent," I stated, my tone dropping to a chilling, perfectly level register. "I own the liquidity underwriting, the institutional bank you begged for survival. My algorithms dictate the market you claim to conquer. You built a crumbling, rotting house on top of my concrete foundation." Vincent stared at the binder. The color-coded tabs protruded from the edges, bright and immaculate against the sterile gray environment. "Open it," I commanded. He hesitated, his fingers twitching against the steel cuffs. He slowly reached forward, flipping the heavy cover open. "You believed you executed a flawless, invisible heist," I said, leaning back into my chair, resting my hands on my lap. "You ordered Trent Wallace to infiltrate my penthouse on Tuesday morning. You believed I functioned as a naive, technologically illiterate target. You thought I would never notice the physical theft of my biometric token." Vincent swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the first page. He saw the high-definition surveillance stills of Trent tearing through my bookshelves. "Trent breached my perimeter at exactly 9:15 in the morning," I continued, tracing the timeline with forensic precision. "He stole exactly 42 grams of titanium. He departed my residence believing he erased his physical footprint. You assumed you possessed days, perhaps weeks, before I noticed the missing hardware." I leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance across the table, ensuring he absorbed the absolute, terrifying velocity of my retaliation. "I returned to my apartment at 2 o'clock on the exact same afternoon," I revealed. The color drained entirely from Vincent's face. His head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening in profound, paralyzing shock. "I accessed my hidden surveillance array," I explained, watching his reality fracture. I watched Trent steal the key. I did not panic. I sat at my workstation and initiated a ghost node monitoring terminal. At exactly 2:45 on that very same afternoon, I watched your chief financial officer authenticate the forged documents. I tracked the $50 million the moment it exited the commercial underwriter's escrow account. A low, agonizing wheeze escaped Vincent's lungs. He realized I did not discover his crime after the fact. I monitored the felony in real time. "I peeled back your offshore routing hashes," I stated, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You utilized a Caribbean shell company named Vanguard Horizon to wash the capital. You fundamentally misunderstood the digital architecture you attempted to manipulate. Did you order a basic forensic diagnostic on that corporate entity? Did you cross-reference the registry with federal watch lists?" Vincent squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head slowly, the cold sweat dripping from his chin onto his ruined tuxedo shirt. "Vanguard Horizon operates as an active, heavily monitored federal honeypot," I informed him, driving the final nail into his coffin. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation flagged that entity 18 months prior. You took my pristine identity and dragged it directly through a radioactive, internationally monitored securities fraud syndicate. You handed the federal government a flawlessly mapped digital confession." I reached across the table, flipping the thick pages of the portfolio, bypassing the blue and yellow tabs. I stopped at the bright green section. "And then, you permitted Serena to liquidate the stolen capital," I noted, gesturing to the photographs. "She swiped a corporate credit card across Manhattan, liquidating $65,000 on a diamond necklace. I tracked the application programming interface of your banking ledger. I geo-tagged every single social media upload she posted. I bound your stolen $50 million directly to her physical greed, building an impenetrable evidentiary cage around your entire family." Vincent stared at the photograph of Serena wearing the diamonds, holding a glass of champagne. His breathing deteriorated into rapid, shallow gasps. The absolute, unmitigated magnitude of his stupidity crashed over him. "You spent your entire life mocking my empty wallet," I said, my voice entirely devoid of mercy. "You mocked my unbranded clothing. You called me a sheep. You believed your bespoke suits and your loud, aggressive leverage constituted true power." I paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to drown in the realization. "I orchestrated your absolute destruction without breaking a single sweat," I whispered. I sat in my penthouse, drinking a cup of coffee, and compiled the evidence that will sentence you to decades in a federal penitentiary. I watched you brag about $50 million to Alistair Thorne, knowing I already transmitted this exact portfolio to the white-collar crime division. The final shred of Vincent Caldwell's sanity snapped, his arrogant facade, cultivated over 3 decades of psychological abuse and corporate deception, completely pulverized into dust. He collapsed forward. His forehead hit the scratched stainless steel table with a dull, heavy thud. He began to weep. It did not manifest as a quiet, dignified sorrow. It erupted as a visceral, pathetic sobbing. His shoulders convulsed violently. The steel transport cuffs clattered against the metal surface as he buried his face in his trembling hands. The chief executive officer of Caldwell Brokerage cried like a broken, terrified child facing the inescapable consequences of his own monumental hubris. I did not offer him a tissue. I did not place a comforting hand on his shoulder. I looked at Victoria. The powerhouse attorney offered a single, curt nod, confirming the execution concluded flawlessly. She snapped her leather briefcase shut, the sharp sound cutting through Vincent's hysterical weeping. I stood up from the metal chair. I smoothed the fabric of my simple black dress, ensuring my posture remained perfectly aligned. "Leverage is the foundation of empires. Vincent." I quoted his own steakhouse advice back to him, my tone echoing with absolute finality. "But leveraging assets you do not possess always ends in a catastrophic margin call. Your account is entirely liquidated." I turned my back on the weeping man. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked toward the heavy steel door, my footsteps steady and uncompromising. Victoria opened the exit. Holding it wide, I stepped out of the freezing interrogation room and crossed the threshold into the brightly lit corridor, leaving the rotting remains of the Caldwell Empire locked permanently in the dark. I pushed the heavy glass door along its tracks, crossing the threshold onto the wraparound terrace. The freezing wind of late January 2011 struck my face, carrying the distant mechanical roar of Manhattan. I walked to the steel railing, wrapping my fingers around the freezing metal. I looked out over the glittering skyline. The towering skyscrapers pierced the low-hanging clouds, projecting grids of illuminated windows into the dark winter night. They stood as massive monuments to capital, monuments that survived the economic wreckage of 2008 because institutional leaders like Alistair Thorne relied on architects like me. Down in the financial district, one specific high-rise contained a dark, vacant floor. Caldwell Brokerage no longer existed. The Monday morning following the Christmas gala, a fleet of moving trucks lined the curb outside the corporate headquarters. Federal agents marched through the executive suite, loading towering stacks of server racks onto steel dollies. They seized every digital asset, every hard drive, and every printed ledger. Contractors utilized heavy iron crowbars to pry the brass letters bearing my father's name off the marble lobby wall. The metal clattered against the floor, leaving behind nothing but dirty, adhesive silhouettes. The firm dissolved into a cautionary tale, a footnote buried in federal regulatory training manuals. The judicial process operated with crushing, unyielding velocity. Vincent and Trent possess no leverage, no capital, and absolutely no defense. The master dossier I provided left their high-priced attorneys with zero maneuvering room. The digital paper trail I mapped eliminated every conceivable legal loophole. The defense lawyers advised Vincent to plead guilty, stripping him of the opportunity to perform for a jury. He stood before a federal judge, wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, and audibly confessed to wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and international money laundering. The judge struck the wooden gavel, delivering a sentence that guaranteed my father would breathe his final breaths inside a concrete cage. Vincent Caldwell now navigates an environment where his former title holds zero currency. In the maximum security federal penitentiary, leverage does not exist. He wakes at exactly 5 a.m. to the blare of a mechanical horn. He lines up against a cinder block wall, waiting for a correctional officer to count his presents. He eats heavily processed food from a divided plastic tray, surrounded by men who do not care about his former bespoke tailoring or his vintage wine collections. The psychological isolation crushes him. He spends 23 hours a day locked inside a cell, drowning in the inescapable realization that his quiet, unassuming daughter orchestrated his total obliteration without ever raising her voice. Trent Wallace shares the same facility. Though they do not speak, the accomplices turned entirely on each other during the federal depositions, trading vicious accusations in desperate, futile attempts to secure plea deals. The prosecutors refused every offer. They possessed the master dossier. They required no further testimony. Serena experienced a descent uniquely tailored to her vanity. The blast radius incinerated her fabricated aristocratic identity. Federal asset forfeiture teams executed their warrants with surgical brutality. They marched into her luxury condominium and stripped it bare. They confiscated the $65,000 diamond necklace directly from the evidence locker, ensuring she would never touch the stones again. They towed the imported sports car. They cataloged the designer dresses, seizing the very silk off her hangers. She walked out of the building carrying a single cardboard box of generic personal effects. Today, Serena navigates the grueling physical reality of minimum wage retail labor. She works at a department store situated merely blocks away from the boutiques where she previously flaunted my stolen credit. She stands for 8 hours a day on hard linoleum, wearing mandated, uncomfortable uniform shoes, her manicured nails chipped weeks ago, ruined by unpacking heavy cardboard boxes and hanging inventory. She cannot afford a taxi. She rides the subway, gripping a cold metal pole, surrounded by the exact middle-class reality she spent her entire youth mocking. The ultimate punishment occurs when the high society elite she desperately courted enter the store. Former associates walk directly up to her register. They place luxury garments on the counter. Serena must scan the barcodes, fold the cashmere, and hand them the shopping bags, forcing a tight, humiliated smile. The socialites look directly through her, actively averting their eyes, treating her exactly like the disposable, invisible asset she once considered me to be. Her greed built her a throne of lies. The truth handed her a name tag and a minimum wage time card. I stepped away from the freezing steel railing, retreating into the sterile, 68-degree environment of my penthouse. The heavy glass door slid shut, instantly severing the roar of the city wind. I walked past the dark kitchen, entering my home office. The server rack hummed, a low, steady frequency vibrating through the hardwood floor. My 6 monitors cast a crisp, white illumination across the glass desk. The proprietary algorithms scrolled relentlessly, executing millions of microtransactions, balancing international ledgers, and commanding the institutional liquidity markets of 2010. Vincent and Trent are serving decades in a federal penitentiary. Serena, stripped of all stolen assets, is working a minimum wage retail job, completely blacklisted from high society. My empire remains unshakable, built on absolute integrity and apex intellect. I did not rely on loud boasts, aggressive leverage, or the psychological manipulation of subordinates. I survived the toxic gravity of my bloodline and emerged fundamentally untouchable. The overarching truth of this journey is that true power does not roar, it calculates. Toxic individuals often mistake patience for weakness, assuming they can trample your boundaries to build their own false crowns. But when you refuse to shrink yourself and instead weaponize your own brilliance, you realize that your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. Authentic security is built on independence, placing you infinitely beyond the reach of those who try to destroy you. If you enjoyed watching this arrogant CEO get exactly what he deserved, please hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of absolute justice. Thank you so much for watching, and stay strong.